The Locked Library at Ashgrove Castle, a Hercule Poirot mystery. Chapter 1. An Invitation in October Rain. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which I shall always remember, because Tuesdays in October had, for some years, been the day on which Poirot insisted upon a particular variety of Belgian chocolate being delivered to the flat in Whitehaven Mansions. He was a man of fixed habits, my friend Hercule Poirot, and the displacement of a chocolate from its appointed hour could, I had observed, alter the arrangement of his entire morning. I had come up from the country that week, having been released for a fortnight from certain obligations in Devon, and was sitting in the armchair by the fire with a copy of the Times folded across my knee. The rain beat against the long windows in a manner peculiar to London in autumn, a fine, persistent rain that seemed less concerned with falling than with insinuating itself into every crevice of the city. Poirot stood at his small writing desk, examining a piece of cream-coloured stationery between his fingers as though it were a curious specimen brought to him from the tropics. "Hastings," he said without turning, "we are invited to the country." "Are we, by Jove? Whose country?" "A certain Lady Margaret Ashgrove. The estate is in Suffolk. She writes that her late husband was acquainted with me in connection with a small affair in Cairo some years past, and that she now finds herself in a situation which she does not wish to describe upon paper, but which she begs me to investigate before, as she puts it, the matter becomes irretrievable." I sat up straighter at this. A case, then? Perhaps. Or perhaps only the nervous fancy of a woman alone in a great house. One cannot say from a letter of so few lines. He turned the page over and held it up to the light from the standard lamp. "But observe, mon ami, the writing is firm, the lines do not waver, the punctuation is exact. This is not a hysteric. This is a woman who has considered carefully before she set pen to paper, and who has chosen her words to be at once urgent and discreet. That in itself is interesting. You'll go then?" "We shall go, Hastings. Together, naturally. You're useful to me in matters such as these. You ask the questions which I cannot ask because you do not know they are questions." I let this pass, as I had learnt to do. Poirot's compliments had a manner of arriving wrapped in something else, and one had to unwrap them with patience. The journey from Liverpool Street the next morning was undertaken in the company of a thermos flask of tisane — Poirot would not travel without it — and 3 small valises arranged with the precision of a regimental drill. I had brought one valise, badly packed. He looked at it once, said nothing, and his silence was eloquent. Ashgrove Castle was not a castle in the proper sense. It was, as we discovered upon emerging from the station at the village of Ashgrove under Hill, a Tudor house of grey stone with later additions in red brick, set upon a low rise above a series of water meadows. A motor car had been sent to meet us, and the driver, a thin man in a green livery, was not communicative. He took our cases, settled us in the rear seat and drove in silence along 3 miles of Hedgeroad Lane. It was Lady Margaret herself who received us in the great hall. She was perhaps 50, slender, with grey hair drawn back from a face that retained the bones of considerable beauty. She wore black, and there was a narrow pearl at her throat. Her hand, when she gave it to Poirot, was cold. "Monsieur Poirot, I cannot say how grateful I am that you have come. Madame, it is my pleasure to be of service. May I present my friend Captain Hastings?" She turned to me with a small formal bow of the head. "Captain, you are very welcome. I have placed you in the east wing, where I hope you will be comfortable. But before you change for dinner, may I beg a quarter hour of your time, monsieur, in the morning room?" The morning room was small, panelled in oak that had darkened with 3 centuries of fires, and lit only by a single tall window which looked out upon a yew-walk. Lady Margaret seated herself in a high-backed chair and folded her hands in her lap. Poirot took the chair opposite. I, feeling slightly extraneous, placed myself at a discreet distance by the window. "Monsieur Poirot," she began, "I'm going to be quite plain with you. I believe that someone in this house is preparing to commit a murder. I do not know who, I do not know how, but I have lived in this house for 31 years, and I know its weather, and the weather has changed." Poirot inclined his head. "Madame, this is a remarkable statement. Will you permit me a question? Whom do you believe to be in danger?" She hesitated, and in that hesitation I saw for the first time the cost of what she was doing. "I do not know that either. I only know that I am afraid. There is a quality in this household at present which I cannot name, but I recognise. My husband, before he died, was a magistrate for many years, and he taught me something of how to read a room. The room I am living in, monsieur, is wrong. Who is presently in residence at Ashgrove? My brother-in-law, Colonel Edmund Ashgrove. My niece, Veronica Ashgrove, who is Edmund's daughter. My ward, Miss Cecily Pell, who has lived with me since the death of her parents some 12 years past. My husband's old friend, Dr. Julian Hare, who is staying for a fortnight. My secretary, Mr. Stephen Lockwood, and the household, Mrs. Burling the housekeeper, Pearson the butler, my own maid Janet, and the kitchen staff. There is also, since Saturday, a guest of Veronica's, a young man called Anthony Fane. 8 persons of the family and guests, then. Donc, madame, I shall not ask you tonight to elaborate upon your suspicions. I prefer to come to my own conclusions, observing freshly. May I be presented to the company at dinner as a friend of your late husband, here on a matter of correspondence? Of course. And one further request. The library. You mention in your letter that the library is locked. May I ask why? Her eyes flickered, only for an instant, but Poirot's eyes followed the flicker as a cat follows a moth. It has been kept locked since my husband's death, monsieur. He died in that room 4 years ago. I have not entered it since. And the key? The key is on a hook in my private sitting room. No one else is permitted to touch it. I see. Poirot rose very gravely. Madame, I thank you for your confidence. I shall do what I can. We dressed for dinner. The east wing was old, and my room looked out upon a kitchen garden where the late roses were finishing in the rain. As I tied my tie before the long mirror, I found I could not entirely shake off Lady Margaret's phrase. The room I am living in is wrong. It seemed to me, as I stood there, that I could feel the wrongness she described. A pressure in the air, perhaps, or only the press of an old house against new visitors. I am not, as Poirot reminds me, an imaginative man, but I am not deaf to atmosphere, and the atmosphere of Ashgrove Castle, on that wet October evening, was not the atmosphere of a happy house. I went down the great staircase a little before 8, and found Poirot already in the drawing-room, immaculate in evening dress, twirling the points of his moustaches with the gentle absorption of a man arranging flowers. He looked at me, and a small smile passed across his face. Hastings, you have, I see, been thinking. A little. It is a beginning, he said. Now, mon ami, we must observe. Chapter 2. The Company at Table. The drawing-room at Ashgrove was a long room, running the full depth of the house, with windows at each end and a great fireplace in the middle wall. The fire had been built up against the chill, and the company was already assembled when Poirot and I entered. Lady Margaret stood by the fire, conversing in a low voice with a tall, white-moustached man, whom I took at once for Colonel Edmund Ashgrove. He was perhaps 60, ramrod straight, with the weathered face of a man who has spent a lifetime out of doors, and he held a glass of sherry in one hand with the air of a man who had taken the same glass at the same hour for 40 years. When we approached, he turned and offered me a firm, dry handshake. Captain Hastings, Margaret has told us you and Monsieur Poirot are visiting on some matter of papers. Always papers. Papers. My brother left a great deal of correspondence behind him. He had a clipped military manner of speaking, every consonant precise. Just so, Colonel. Allow me to present you, my daughter Veronica. A young woman of perhaps 26 rose from a low chair near the fire. She was tall, dark-haired, handsome rather than beautiful, with the kind of face that one notices before one likes. She wore a dark green dress that I supposed had cost a great deal of money, and she gave me her hand as if she were granting me a favour. Captain, Charmé. The young man at her elbow, who must have been Anthony Fane, was perhaps 30, fair, slightly built, with a clever, narrow mouth and very bright blue eyes. He had a way of standing close to Veronica without quite touching her, as if there were a current passing between them which he did not wish to interrupt. He bowed to Poirot with what struck me as a faint trace of irony. Monsieur Poirot, I have read of you, of course, one does. You're most kind. Anthony writes, Veronica said. He has written one novel which was very nearly published, and another which is very nearly finished. He claims this gives him the right to be insufferable, and we humour him. Veronica, said Anthony, smiling, is an excellent humourer. A silence might have followed had not Lady Margaret moved across the room with the calm of an experienced hostess, and brought forward a slight fair-haired girl who had been sitting almost invisible in the window seat. "Cecily, my dear, come and meet our guests. This is my ward, Miss Cecily Pell. Cecily, Captain Hastings, and Monsieur Poirot." Cecily Pell was perhaps 23, but she had the air of a much younger woman, or perhaps a much older one. I could not at first decide. Her hair was very pale, almost ash, and her eyes were a curious light grey. She wore a dress of dove-grey silk that had been chosen for her, I thought, rather than by her, and she shook hands as though she had been taught to do so by someone who had stood over her. "How do you do?" she said. The voice was low and a little flat. "Mademoiselle, I am enchanted." She did not reply, but withdrew at once to the window seat. Veronica laughed lightly. "Cecily is shy of strangers. She has been shy of strangers for 12 years, and we have all given up trying to cure her." "Veronica," said Lady Margaret very quietly, "that is unkind." The colour rose in Veronica's cheek, but she only shrugged and turned away. 2 other gentlemen now approached. The elder, Dr. Julian Hare, was a stout, ruddy man of perhaps 65, with a fringe of white hair and a benevolent, slightly absent manner. His voice was warm, his handshake hearty. The younger, Stephen Lockwood, the secretary, was a man of perhaps 35, dark, with a quiet, controlled face, and the kind of hands which I always associate with men who have done a great deal of writing. He was introduced last, and I had the impression that he was always introduced last, that the household had arranged itself in a hierarchy in which he stood, perhaps by his own preference, somewhat below the family. "Mr. Lockwood was Sir Henry's secretary for 15 years, said Lady Margaret, "and since my husband's death he has been good enough to remain and assist me with the estate." "It is no trouble, Lady Margaret." Pearson the butler appeared, announced dinner, and we processed in pairs into the dining-room. I was placed beside Cecily Pell. Poirot was placed across from me, between Veronica and Dr. Hare. The Colonel took the head of the table, Lady Margaret the foot. Anthony Fane sat at Veronica's other hand, and Stephen Lockwood beside Cecily opposite Poirot. The dinner was excellent, a clear soup, a dish of soles, partridge, and a savoury, but it is not the dinner I remember. It is the conversation. For Poirot, having greeted the company with all the gentle deference of a foreign visitor, now began to draw them out one by one, with the seemingly casual curiosity of a man making polite chat. "Colonel Ashgrove," he said, "I understand you have lived a great deal abroad. India, was it not?" 22 years, monsieur. The Punjab mostly. Came home when my brother died, to be of what use I could to Margaret." "And you have remained?" "I have remained." There was a brief pause. There was nothing in India for me to go back to. A great change, n'est-ce pas? One adjusts. "And Mademoiselle Veronica, you have lived here always?" "Since I was 19. I came back from school in Switzerland the year my father returned from India. Switzerland is most agreeable." "It was very dull." Anthony Fane laughed at this. "Veronica finds most places dull." "Most places," she said, "are dull." Poirot smiled and turned his attention to Dr. Hare. "And you, Doctor? You're an old friend of the family?" 40 years, monsieur. Henry Ashgrove and I were at Cambridge together. I have come down to Ashgrove twice a year ever since. A man of my age does not lightly break his habits." "And you find the house unchanged?" The doctor's geniality dimmed, almost imperceptibly. "The house is unchanged, monsieur. It is the people who change, or perhaps not change, rather are revealed by time." Across the table, Cecily Pell had not lifted her eyes from her plate. "Mademoiselle Pell," said Poirot, "you are very quiet." She looked up, startled. I have nothing to say, monsieur." That is a thing which is sometimes said by those who have a great deal to say. Stephen Lockwood beside her said in his quiet voice, "Miss Pell does not enjoy general conversation, monsieur. She prefers to read. We share that preference." It was the first time he had spoken at table, and I noticed, as I have noticed in other quiet men, that when he spoke the table listened. Cecily, I thought, gave him the smallest grateful glance. The savoury came and went. Lady Margaret rose, the ladies withdrew, and the gentlemen were left with the port. The Colonel took up the talk of shooting. Dr. Hare contributed reminiscences of past seasons. Anthony Fane was politely bored. Lockwood was politely silent. Poirot listened, and I, watching him across the table, saw that he was not drinking his port, and that his eyes were resting with the still, unblinking concentration of a heron at a river bank upon Anthony Fane. When at last we joined the ladies, the rain had stopped. Lady Margaret played a little Chopin badly. Cecily turned the pages for her. Veronica and Anthony stood by the long window speaking in undertones. The Colonel read, "The Field." Stephen Lockwood excused himself early, pleading correspondence. It was nearly 11 when Poirot and I climbed the stairs together. Outside my door he laid a finger on my arm. "Hastings, tell me, what did you observe?" "That young Fane is a slippery customer," I said, "and that the niece is in love with him, or thinks she is, that the Colonel doesn't much care for him, that the doctor knows more of the family than he says, that Miss Pell is frightened of something or someone, and that Lockwood is in love with Miss Pell." Poirot looked at me with an expression of mild astonishment. "Hastings, you see, sometimes I underestimate you. Is any of it correct?" "All of it is correct, mon ami. Not one item is the whole truth, but every item is correct. Bonne nuit." He went away down the corridor, humming softly. I stood for a moment looking after him, and then I went into my room and shut the door, and for the first time that evening I was glad of the heavy oak between myself and the rest of the house. Chapter 3. A Cry in the Long Gallery. I slept poorly. The fault lay partly with the strange bed, partly with the wind which had risen after midnight and now flung itself in gusts against the eastern wall of the house, but mostly, I think, with my own mind, which would not stop turning over the faces I had seen at dinner. It must have been about 2:30 when I was woken, not by the wind, but by a sound which the wind could not have made. A short, sharp cry, abruptly cut off. A woman's cry. I sat up. The fire in the grate had died to embers. For a moment I doubted whether I had heard the cry at all or only dreamed it. Then I heard distinctly the sound of a door opening somewhere along the corridor and a soft footfall on the boards. I rose, pulled on my dressing gown and lit a candle. My door, when I opened it, gave upon the long upper gallery which ran the length of the east wing, lined with old portraits and lit, when lit at all, by a single oil lamp at the far end. The lamp was not burning. The gallery was dark except for my candle and the cold grey light from the windows at the gallery's end. A figure stood at the far window. For a moment I could not make it out. Then I saw it was a woman in a pale dressing gown, her hand pressed against the glass. "Who is there?" I said. My voice sounded loud in the silence. The figure turned. It was Cecily Pell. Her face, in the dim light, was the colour of the moon, and her eyes seemed enormous. "Captain Hastings." "Miss Pell, are you all right? I thought I heard a cry." "A cry?" "Yes, a woman's cry. Did you not hear it?" She seemed for a moment not to understand the question. Then a small shudder ran through her. I heard something. I do not know what. I came out to look. I've been standing here, I think, for some time." "Some time? Alone? Miss Pell, you ought to go back to bed. You're shivering." She nodded distantly but did not move. It was at that moment that another door opened. Poirot's door, halfway down the gallery. My friend emerged fully dressed, even to his patent leather slippers, and bearing a candle of his own. He took in the scene at a glance. "Bonsoir, mademoiselle. Hastings. So, we have all heard, then, the cry." "You heard it too?" I said. "I heard it. I waited a moment to see if any other should emerge. Mademoiselle Pell is with yourself, the only one to do so. Mademoiselle, where were you when you heard the cry?" "In my bed, monsieur, in my room." "Which is?" "At the far end of the gallery, the corner room." "You came out at once?" Yes, I think so." "And as you came along the gallery, did you pass any door which was open, or which opened?" "No." "Monsieur, all the doors were shut." "Including," said Poirot very gently, "the door of Lady Margaret?" Cecily's hand went for a fraction of a second to her throat. "Lady Margaret's door is on the other side of the house. It does not open upon this gallery." "Ah, bien sûr. I forget the geography, forgive me. And the cry, could you tell from where it came?" From below, I thought. Or perhaps from the south gallery. I am not sure. The house plays tricks with sound." "It does indeed." Poirot turned to me. "Hastings, will you have the goodness to rouse Pearson and ask him, with my compliments, to make a tour of the principal rooms, and to inform Lady Margaret that I beg her to remain in her room until we have ascertained that all is well." "Right," I went down. The house was very still. Pearson, when I knocked at his door behind the green baize, came out at once, having clearly been awakened by the sound of his own bell long before I touched it. He was already in trousers and waistcoat, and his face was grave. "I heard, Captain. I was about to come up." "Mr. Poirot would like a quick check of the principal rooms." "Very good, Captain." I went with him. We checked the drawing room, the dining room, the morning room, the gun room, the small study where Lady Margaret kept her accounts. All in order, all quiet, all dark. We came at last to the door of the library. Pearson stopped. "This door, Captain, is locked. It has been locked for 4 years." "I know. Should we—" "Try it." He laid his hand upon the great brass handle. It turned. The door swung inward, and a draught of cold, slightly musty air came out at us, with beneath it a fainter, sharper smell which I did not at first identify. "Good God," said Pearson. I stepped past him with the candle. The library at Ashgrove Castle was a high, square room, 2 stories tall, lined on every wall with books to a height of perhaps 15 feet, with a wrought-iron gallery running round at the level of the upper shelves. Heavy curtains were drawn across the windows. A long writing table stood in the middle of the room, and upon it a green-shaded reading lamp had been left burning, throwing a circle of light upon the leather blotter and upon the man who lay across the blotter, his arms flung out, his cheek pressed to the leather, his eyes wide open and unseeing. It was Anthony Fane. There was a small dark mark on his temple. There was no blood to speak of upon the blotter. There was a curious, faint sweetness in the air which mingled with the cold mustiness of the room. "Don't touch anything," I said. My voice was steadier than I had supposed it would be. "Pearson, fetch Mr. Poirot, at once." He went without a word. I stood in the doorway with my candle and looked at the dead man, and at the great locked room which had not been locked, and at the lamp which had been lit although no one was supposed to enter, and I thought, with a chill that had nothing to do with the draught, she was right. She was perfectly right. The room she's living in is wrong. Poirot came at a run, or what passed for Poirot, for a run, a brisk and dignified procession down the staircase. He paused at the threshold of the library and stood for perhaps a full minute without entering, his eyes moving slowly across the scene, taking in the lamp, the body, the position of the writing chair, the rug, the curtains, the door of a smaller inner cabinet which stood ajar at the far end of the room. Then he stepped inside, very carefully, placing his feet as a man places them on ice. He bent over Anthony Fane. He did not touch the body. He merely looked and sniffed once and looked again. He examined the temple, the hands, the slight twist of the mouth. "He has been dead," he said quietly. "Perhaps an hour, perhaps a little less. The blow to the temple did not kill him, Hastings. Observe, the bruise is shallow, the skin only barely broken. It stunned him. That killed him." He pointed without touching to a small glass tumbler which stood at the very edge of the writing table, half concealed by the dead man's outflung arm. A trace of liquid remained at the bottom. Poirot leaned close, and sniffed again, and the lines of his face composed themselves into the expression which I had come, over many years, to recognise as the expression of a man who is no longer guessing. "Bitter almonds," he said. "Mon Dieu, cyanide. It is the classical method, and yet it is always shocking, non? He was poisoned, and then perhaps struck, and then poisoned. We shall see. But Hastings, observe one thing further." He pointed to the man's right hand. The fingers were curled, and between them was caught a small, irregular fragment of paper, perhaps the size of a thumbnail. Poirot did not remove it. He merely indicated it, and looked at me. "He had something in his hand when he died," I said. "He had something in his hand when he died, and the something has been taken from him. And only this small piece remains. It was torn from him, Hastings, and torn quickly, and not very carefully. The murderer was, at this moment, in haste. That is the first true thing we know." He straightened. "And the second?" "The second, mon ami, is that this room was locked for 4 years, and tonight it was open. Someone had a key. That is a small fact. But in this affair, the small facts will be everything." He turned to the doorway where Pearson had reappeared white-faced. "Pearson, be so good as to telephone the police, and then, if you please, wake the household, all of them. I wish to speak to no one alone tonight. I wish them all together, in the drawing-room in 15 minutes. Allez." Pearson went. Poirot stood a moment longer, looking down at Anthony Fane. Then he said, as much to himself as to me, "He came here to meet someone. He came alone, and he was expected. He drank what was offered. He was struck after the poison was already at work. The paper in his hand, that was what he came for. Cellar et clair. What is not yet clear, Hastings, is which of 7 people in this house brought him here, and why. But it will become clear. Cela aussi is certain. He turned, and we left the library, and Poirot drew the door to behind us, and produced from his pocket a small handkerchief, with which he pressed lightly upon the brass handle as he closed it. "For the fingerprints," he said, "although I do not think there will be any to find, our friend has been most careful, up to a point." "Up to a point?" "The little piece of paper, Hastings. That is the point at which the carefulness ended. And the carelessness will be the murderer's undoing. Chapter 4. 7 Faces by Lamplight. The drawing-room at 3 o'clock in the morning is a different room from the drawing-room at 9 in the evening. The fire had been built up by Pearson with a kind of grim determination, but its light reached only a little way, and the rest of the long room lay in shadow, the portraits on the walls peering down with the expressions of those who have seen many bad nights, and no longer take particular note of any of them. Lady Margaret sat in the armchair nearest the fire, very straight, her hands folded in her lap. She had dressed completely, black skirt, grey blouse, a small dark shawl about her shoulders, and she might have been receiving callers at a more rational hour, save for her face, which had aged 10 years since dinner. Colonel Ashgrove stood by the mantel, in a dressing-gown of dark red silk over pyjamas, his white moustaches bristling, a brandy in his hand. He had not yet spoken since coming down. Veronica was on the long sofa, in a kimono of jade green, her hair undone and falling about her shoulders. She had been weeping. She was not weeping now. Her eyes were red, but her mouth was set in a hard, determined line, as though she had decided at some point in the last quarter hour to be angry rather than grieved. Cecily Pell sat in a small upright chair, slightly apart from the rest, in the dressing-gown I had seen her in upstairs. She held a handkerchief, but did not use it. She sat looking at the fire, and her face told nothing. Dr. Hare stood beside Lady Margaret's chair, one hand resting upon its high back, in the unconscious posture of a doctor by a patient. He too had dressed. Stephen Lockwood was the last to enter, and entered quietly, fully dressed in the dark suit he had worn at dinner. His face, when he saw the company, betrayed nothing. He took a chair at the room's edge near the door, as if he wished to be useful but not central. Poirot stood before the fire, his hands clasped behind his back, very small and very still. "My friends," he began, "I shall not ask you to forgive me for the hour. Forgiveness is for matters less grave. I shall tell you what has occurred, and I shall ask of each of you certain questions, and I shall ask you to tell me, between this hour and dawn, only the truth. Lies, in this room tonight, will not save anyone. They will only cost time, and time, in such a matter, is the enemy." He paused. "Mr. Anthony Fane has been killed." Veronica made a sound, half cry, half indrawn breath, and pressed her fist against her mouth. The Colonel's brandy glass shook, very slightly in his hand. Lady Margaret closed her eyes briefly and opened them again. Cecily did not move. Dr. Hare bowed his head. Stephen Lockwood's expression did not change, but I saw his hand on the arm of his chair tighten. "Where?" said the Colonel. His voice was hoarse. "In the library, Colonel. The library has been locked for 4 years. It was not locked tonight. The door stood unlocked and a lamp had been lit. Mr. Fane was poisoned, and afterwards, or perhaps before, was struck on the temple. The poison was, I have little doubt, cyanide. He had been there perhaps an hour when Captain Hastings and Pearson found him." "Cyanide," murmured Dr. Hare. "In this house. Good God!" "Doctor," said Poirot, "we shall come to you presently. For the moment, I ask of you only this. In your professional opinion, would death from such a dose be quick?" "Within minutes, perhaps less." "Thank you." Poirot turned. "Lady Margaret, the key to the library, where is it now?" "It is on its hook in my sitting-room, monsieur. I have not touched it, but I believe it to be there. I have not yet looked." "We shall look together presently. And you, Lady Margaret, when did you last see Anthony Fane alive?" "In this room, at a little before 11. He and Veronica were standing by the long window. When I retired, they were still there. And after you retired?" "I went to my room, monsieur. I rang for Janet, who undressed me. She left me at perhaps 11:15. I read for some time, perhaps until midnight. Then I put out the light. I heard nothing further until Pearson knocked at my door. Janet will confirm the times? She will? Good. Veronica, mademoiselle, you and Mr. Fane were in this room when Lady Margaret retired. What followed? Veronica drew a long breath. Her voice, when it came, was steadier than I had expected. Anthony and I sat by the window for perhaps another quarter of an hour. He was restless. He had been restless all evening. He said he wished to take a turn outside before bed. I told him not to be a fool, that it was raining, and that besides, there was nothing to see in the dark. He laughed and said one never knew what one might see in the dark. He went out by the garden door and I went up to my room. That was at perhaps 11:30. Did he take a coat? His own coat, yes, from the cloakroom by the garden door. Did you hear him return? No, my room is at the front of the house. I heard nothing. And when did you fall asleep? I did not. Not until very late. I lay awake. I had been quarrelling with Anthony earlier. At dinner, you may have noticed. I was going over it. What was the quarrel about, mademoiselle? She hesitated. Her eyes flicked for an instant to her father by the fireplace and back to Poirot. He had told me this morning that he wished to break our engagement. A silence fell over the room. You were engaged, said Lady Margaret quietly. Veronica, you did not tell me. It was not formal, Aunt Margaret. We had an understanding. He wished to ask father this weekend, and then, this morning he said he had changed his mind. He said there was someone else. Did he name her? He did not. Poirot inclined his head. Thank you, mademoiselle. You have been very honest, and you will not regret it. Mon colonel, your turn, if you please. When did you retire, and what did you hear? The colonel set down his brandy glass with a small click. I went up at perhaps 11:15, monsieur. I read for half an hour. I extinguished my light at, I should say, 10 minutes to 12. I slept until I was woken by Pearson. You heard no cry? None. Your room is in the south wing. The cry, as I understand it, came from the library or thereabouts, which is in the east wing. I should not have heard it. Bien, doctor, your movements? I retired with the others, monsieur. I read in bed. Trollope. Since you may wish to know, for perhaps an hour. I slept. I was woken by Pearson. You heard nothing? Nothing? Mr. Lockwood? Lockwood looked up. I went to my room directly after dinner, monsieur, as you may recall. I worked at correspondence until nearly 1 o'clock. I then went to bed. I heard no cry. I was woken by Pearson. Your room is above the library, monsieur. Poirot's eyes rested upon him for a long moment. Above the library, tiens, and in the hours during which you worked, you heard, from below, nothing? Nothing, monsieur. The library, when its door is shut, is one of the quietest rooms in the house. The walls are very thick and the floor between is double-boarded against draughts. You're well informed about the construction of the library, Mr. Lockwood. I worked in it for 15 years, monsieur. With Sir Henry? Of course. Poirot's voice was mild. Mademoiselle Pell, your turn, s'il vous plaît. Cecily looked up. The firelight caught her pale hair and the curve of her cheek. She spoke with a strange flat clarity, as if reciting. I went to my room when Lady Margaret played the piano. She finished, and I went up. I undressed. I read for a little. I extinguished my candle. I lay awake. I heard a sound which I thought was a cry. I rose. I came out into the gallery. I stood at the window. Captain Hastings found me there. Then Monsieur Poirot came. You were standing at the window, said Poirot. For how long before Captain Hastings found you? I do not know, monsieur. Some minutes, perhaps. You did not call out when you heard the cry? No, monsieur. You did not knock at any door? No. Monsieur? You did not light a lamp? No, monsieur. Poirot regarded her gently. Mademoiselle, you came out into the gallery in the dark in your dressing gown without a candle, without calling, and you stood by the window. You will forgive me if I find this conduct, in a young lady who has heard a cry of distress, a little unusual. Cecily's eyes lifted to his, and for the first time I saw in them an expression which was neither blankness nor fear, but a kind of weariness so old that I did not know what to call it. Monsieur Poirot, she said, I am not always brave. Sometimes I'm only quiet. There is a difference. A small silence followed this. Poirot bowed. You're quite right, mademoiselle. There is a difference. I beg your pardon. He turned and addressed the room. "My friends, I shall not detain you further tonight. You will go now to your rooms, where you will remain until the police arrive, which will be at perhaps 6 o'clock. Pearson will bring tea to those who desire it. I ask of you only one further thing. If, between now and morning, any of you finds that there is some matter, however small, however painful, which you have failed to mention this evening, I beg you to come to me with it before you tell it to the police. You will find me in this room. I shall not sleep tonight." They rose. They went out in pairs and singly, with the slow, careful tread of people who have been stunned by a blow they have not yet fully felt. Lady Margaret was the last to leave. She paused at the door and looked back at Poirot, and he inclined his head to her, and she went out without speaking. When we were alone, Poirot moved at once to the writing desk by the window, sat down, took up a sheet of paper, and began to write, not, as I supposed, notes upon the case, but a list. I came and stood at his shoulder. It was a list of times. Lady M retires, 10:55. Janet leaves Lady M, 11:15. Veronica retires, 11:30. Fane goes out by garden door, 11:30. Colonel retires, 11:15. Colonel reads until 11:50. Hare retires. Lockwood works until 1. Cecily retires, 10:45. Cry heard, 2:30 approximately. Body discovered, 2:50. Beside each name, he had drawn a small symbol, sometimes a tick, sometimes a question mark, sometimes a small cross. "Hastings," he said, "you will tell me what is wrong with this list." I studied it. Well, Anthony Fane went out at 11:30 and was in the library by, 2 o'clock or earlier? Where was he in the meantime, précisément? 2.5 hours. Where was he and with whom? That, mon ami, is the first hole. There are others. Find them, and we shall be making progress. I looked again, more slowly. Cecily went to her room at 11:15, but Lady Margaret was still playing the piano. You said it was when Lady Margaret played that Cecily went up. Lady Margaret finished playing later. Poirot's eyes lit. Bon, you see, the times do not quite agree. We have a small inconsistency. Mademoiselle Cecily went up earlier perhaps than the others believe, or her account of when she went up is not exact. And Lockwood worked until 1 o'clock, but he worked above the library, and the library door was unlocked and a lamp burning. Would he not at some point have come down to ask who was there? "Unless," said Poirot. "He knew already who was there." I stared at him. "I do not say he did, Hastings. I say only that the question must be asked. Eh bien, pour me a brandy, mon ami, and let us sit by the fire and wait for the sun. I have much to think of, and the night is still long." Chapter 5. The inspector and the garden gate inspector Mowbray of the Suffolk Constabulary arrived at 20 minutes past 6 in a motor car driven by a young constable with a face like a turnip. The inspector was a tall, thin man of perhaps 45, with sandy hair receding from a high forehead, and a manner which combined country shrewdness with metropolitan respect for procedure. He had, I gathered, served some years in London before returning to his native county, and his uniform fitted him as though he had been born in it. He shook hands with Poirot with the slightly elaborate courtesy of a provincial officer who has read the newspapers. "Monsieur Poirot, this is a pleasure I had not expected. An honour, I should say." "You're too kind, Inspector. I am here as a private guest, not in any official capacity. I shall be entirely at your disposal." "That's very handsome, sir. Now, the library, if you please." The library at 6 o'clock in the morning was lit, for the first time in 4 years, by daylight. Pearson had drawn back the heavy curtains at the eastern windows, and the cold grey light of an autumn morning fell across the long writing table, the books, the wrought-iron gallery, the body of Anthony Fane, who had not been moved. The police photographer set up his apparatus. The police surgeon, a grizzled man called Dr. Wills, who had, I gathered, known Dr. Hare for many years, set down his bag and went to the body. Poirot stood with the inspector at the threshold and pointed. "The lamp, Inspector. Observe. It has been burning for some hours. The shade is warm to the touch, or was so at 3 o'clock. It will be cool now. The blotter. Observe the surface. There is no trace of writing newly done, no impression of ink, no scattering of pen grit. Mr. Fane did not come here to write. To meet someone, then? To meet someone, or to find something, possibly both. The cabinet at the far end, you observe, is open. The door has been forced. See, the wood by the lock is splintered. Not by Mr. Fane, I think. The splintering is old, perhaps several days old. The dust has settled into it. But the cabinet has been visited recently. The dust on its lower shelf is disturbed. Inspector Mowbray crossed to the cabinet and bent down. You're right, sir. There's something been taken from this shelf. Something rectangular, perhaps. A book or box. Or a packet of papers, yes. And the deceased had a paper in his hand? A torn fragment. Constable, may I ask you to take particular care of that fragment when you remove it? The inspector turned to me. Captain Hastings, you and Pearson found the body. Walk me through it, if you'd be so good. I told him. I described the cry, the gallery, Cecily at the window, Pearson, the unlocked door, the lamp, the body, the paper, the smell of bitter almonds. He listened without interrupting, making small marks in a notebook. And Miss Pell, you say, was at the window already when you came out? She was. How long do you reckon she'd been there? I cannot say. She said some minutes, perhaps longer. And no one else stirred? Not until Pearson rang the bell. He went round the room, slowly, with Poirot at his elbow. He examined the windows, they were latched from the inside. He examined the cabinet. He looked at the position of the chair, which had been pushed back as though Anthony Fane had risen to greet someone, or had been in the act of rising when he was struck. He looked at the small glass tumbler. He sniffed it, and made a face, and did not touch it. He looked at the floor, a Turkish carpet of considerable age, and at one point bent down and picked up a small dark object between finger and thumb. And what is this, sir? Poirot leaned close. Tiens? A small fragment of dried mud, Inspector. Garden mud, I should say, judging by its colour and texture. There is a particular reddish tint to the soil in the lower garden, which I noticed yesterday. Mr. Fane went out by the garden door. He was wearing presumably garden boots or shoes. Yet he is wearing, you observe, evening pumps now, dry, unmarked. He changed his shoes then before coming here? Yes, or, Inspector, he did not, and the mud is from another visitor entirely. The inspector looked at him. You think someone else was in this room tonight in muddy shoes? I think it is a possibility we must keep open. We left the library to the police and went out into the morning. The rain had stopped during the night, and the lawns were heavy with dew, the sky a uniform pearly grey. Poirot led me round the south side of the house to the garden door, a low door under a stone arch, opening into a small flagged yard from which a path led down between yew hedges to the lower gardens. Here, he said. Mr. Fane went out at 11:30. The path is here. The mud, Hastings. Observe. The path was indeed muddy in patches, where rain had collected in the depressions between flagstones. Poirot bent, examined the prints, and then, walking very carefully along the verge, followed the path some 20 yards to a small wrought-iron gate set in the hedge. He stopped at the gate and stood for a long moment. What do you see, Hastings? I came up beside him. The gate stood half open. On the gravel just beyond it were 2 clear sets of footprints, made when the ground was wet, now drying but still distinct. One set was a man's, perhaps size 9, with a smooth sole. Evening shoes, I thought. The other was a woman's, smaller, narrower, with a low heel. 2 people met here, I said. 2 people met here, and separated here also. Observe, the man's prints go on through the gate into the orchard beyond. The woman's prints turn and go back along the path towards the house. Now the man's prints, they continue, do they not, for some distance before they return. We shall follow them shortly, but the woman, Hastings, the woman went back into the house. Could it have been Veronica? She said she went up at 11:30. It could have been Veronica. It could have been Lady Margaret, or Mademoiselle Cecily, or the maid Janet, or Mrs. Burling the housekeeper, or any woman in this house, or indeed any woman from the village. The prints tell us that a woman was here. They do not tell us which woman. The size of the foot. Yes, the size will narrow our field, but not tonight. Allons. We followed the man's prints through the gate and along a soft track between 2 rows of apple trees. The track ended at a small summer house, an octagonal building of weathered wood, the door of which stood open. Poirot peered inside. There was a low table, 2 cane chairs, a strip of carpet, an old oil lamp on a wall bracket. The lamp was cold. They sat here, he said. Not for very long, I think. There is no warmth in the lamp, and the chairs have been only lightly disturbed, but long enough for an exchange. "Now what, Hastings?" was the exchange. "A meeting, certainly. Perhaps the woman who met him here is the someone else Veronica spoke of. Possibly. But a meeting at 11:30 in the rain, in a summer house, is not a meeting of pleasure, mon ami. It is a meeting of necessity. I should say Mr. Fane came here to receive something, or to give something, which could not be received or given in the house. And after the meeting he returned? He returned, yes, but not to bed. He returned to the library, where someone, perhaps the same someone, perhaps another, was waiting for him, and where the cyanide was waiting for him in a glass. Voyons. We turned back. As we passed the gate, Poirot paused once more and bent to the ground, and from the muddy verge picked up something which he held between the points of his fingernails very delicately and dropped into a small envelope from his pocket. "What is it?" "A button, Hastings. A small button of dark horn pulled off, by the look of the threads, with some force, from a man's coat, I should say. From Anthony Fane's coat? That, mon ami, we shall determine in due course. Let us go in. The morning brings appetite, and even murder is improved by a cup of coffee." Chapter 6. The accounts of Mr. Lockwood's breakfast at Ashgrove that morning was a strange and silent meal. Lady Margaret presided, very pale but steady. The Colonel ate with grim determination. Veronica did not appear. Her tray had been taken up. Cecily came down briefly, drank a cup of tea and went out again, her eyes never lifting from the cup. Dr. Hare ate heartily and said nothing of the matter at hand, talking instead of the unusual mildness of the autumn. Stephen Lockwood ate a small piece of toast, drank a cup of black coffee, and excused himself to the library, or rather, to his own office, which lay above the library and which Inspector Mowbray had given him leave to use. It was to Lockwood's office that Poirot betook himself when breakfast was done. The room was small, and its single window looked out, like the library window beneath, onto the kitchen garden. A roll-top desk stood against one wall, a long table, covered in green baize, occupied the centre, and against the third wall stood a tall iron safe of the older pattern. Lockwood was at the desk when we entered, but rose and indicated chairs with the quiet gravity of a man who had been expecting us. "Monsieur Poirot, Captain, I am at your service." "Mr. Lockwood, you are most obliging. I shall not waste your time. You were Sir Henry's secretary for 15 years, and you have continued in Lady Margaret's service since his death. You know, I take it, the financial affairs of the family more thoroughly than any other living person?" "I believe so, monsieur." "I'm going to ask you several questions, and I shall ask you to answer them with absolute candour, even where to do so may seem a breach of confidence. The matter is of murder, and confidence has, I am afraid, become a luxury which the house of Ashgrove can no longer afford." Lockwood inclined his head. "I understand, monsieur. Ask." "What is the value of the Ashgrove estate?" "The land, the house, and the contents. Perhaps £50,000, monsieur. The investments, perhaps another 90,000. The total, very approximately, is £140,000. And to whom does it pass under Sir Henry's will? Lady Margaret has the use of the house, the income from the investments, and a free hand in respect of personal property for her lifetime. On her death, the estate passes to Miss Veronica Ashgrove, with a charge upon it of £15,000 in favour of Miss Cecily Pell. And if Miss Veronica predeceases Lady Margaret, then the estate passes to Colonel Edmund Ashgrove for his lifetime, and upon his death to Miss Cecily Pell absolutely, subject to certain charitable bequests." Poirot's eyes did not leave Lockwood's face. "And if Miss Veronica were to marry before Lady Margaret's death, a person whom Lady Margaret considered unsuitable?" For the first time Lockwood hesitated. "There is a clause, monsieur. It was inserted at Sir Henry's specific direction in the last codicil he signed 6 months before his death. If Miss Veronica marries before the age of 30 without the written consent of her aunt and her father, her interest in the estate is reduced to a fixed sum of £5,000, and the residue passes, on Lady Margaret's death, to Miss Cecily Pell." I drew in my breath. Poirot did not. "Tiens, £5,000 against perhaps 100,000. A considerable difference. Was Miss Veronica aware of this clause?" "She was, monsieur. Sir Henry told her of it himself." "And was Mr. Anthony Fane aware of it?" "I do not know, monsieur, but Miss Veronica is, I have always thought, a young woman who tells her intimates, most things. I should suppose he was aware." "And Lady Margaret would not have given her consent?" Lockwood paused. Lady Margaret had not, to my knowledge, formed an opinion. She had met Mr. Fane only twice before this weekend. The Colonel had formed an opinion. Which was unfavourable, monsieur. Poirot nodded slowly. Mr. Lockwood, I shall now ask a question which may seem indelicate. Forgive me. Your salary at Ashgrove. What is it? Lockwood, to my surprise, gave the slightest of smiles. £300 a year, monsieur, with my keep and a small cottage at the end of the drive. And under Sir Henry's will, you're remembered? I am left £1,000 and the contents of the small library at the Dower House. A handsome bequest. Sir Henry was generous. Mr. Lockwood, you have been candid, and I thank you. One more question. The library, the locked library where Mr. Fane was found, did you have a key? A very small pause. I had a key, monsieur. There were 3 keys in all. Sir Henry's, which was upon his person at the time of his death and was given to Lady Margaret afterwards. Lady Margaret's own, which is on a hook in her sitting room, and mine, which I kept in this safe. Where is your key now? In this safe, monsieur. May I ask you to verify this? Lockwood rose, crossed to the safe, turned the dial in 3 sequences and opened the door. He reached inside, withdrew a small leather case, opened it, and looked inside. His face did not change, but I saw a faint stillness come over him. It is gone, monsieur. When did you last see it? Perhaps a fortnight ago. I had occasion to consult some old papers in this safe. The case was here then. I have not opened the case since. Who has the combination of the safe? Myself and Lady Margaret and Sir Henry, who is dead. I cannot conceive that Lady Margaret would have taken the key without informing me. And the safe is, pardon me, Mr. Lockwood, the safe is of an older type. A man of some little knowledge of such things could open it perhaps without the combination. It is possible, monsieur. The mechanism is not what it once was. Thank you. Please do not announce the loss to anyone for the present. I shall inform Inspector Mowbray myself in due course. Lockwood bowed. We rose to go. At the door, Poirot turned. Mr. Lockwood, one more thing. You said last night that you worked in your office until 1 o'clock. May I ask what you were working upon? The estate accounts, monsieur. I am preparing them for the November audit. May I see them? Lockwood gestured to the long baize table, where a stack of ledgers lay open, weighted by a glass paperweight. They are here, monsieur. Poirot crossed to the table. He turned the pages of the topmost ledger with a careful finger. I joined him. The ledger was a rent book. The entries were in Lockwood's small, neat hand. I noticed that Poirot's eye paused more than once upon certain figures, and that his finger came to rest, eventually, upon an entry which related to a tenant farm called Lower Greve. This rent, Mr. Lockwood. It was not paid in October. It was not, monsieur. The tenant is in difficulty. We have given him an extension. And in September? It was paid in September. And in August? It was paid in August. And yet here, in your ledger, the entry for August is, pardon me, written in a slightly different ink from the entries above and below it. The ink is darker, the line a little thicker. Do you see? Lockwood came forward and bent over the ledger. The colour drained slowly from his face. I had not noticed, monsieur. You had not. It must be that I made the entry at a different time, perhaps, with a different pen. Perhaps. Mr. Lockwood, I am going to leave this ledger upon the table, and I am going to ask you not to alter it, and not to permit it to be altered, until Inspector Mowbray and I have had occasion to examine it more closely. Do I have your word? Lockwood's eyes were on the ledger. After a moment he said very quietly, You have my word, Monsieur Poirot. We went out. In the corridor I waited until we were past the corner before I spoke. Poirot, do you mean... I mean nothing yet, Hastings. But it is interesting, no, that a man whose key is missing, who lives above a locked library, and whose ledger contains an entry in 2 inks, should also be the only member of the household who claims to have heard nothing during a night when a man was murdered beneath his floor. Do you suspect him? I suspect everyone in this house, mon ami. That is to say, I suspect no one. I gather facts. The facts will, in their own time, suspect for me. Chapter 7. The Quiet Ward. It was in the orchard, at about 11 that morning, that we found Cecily Pell. She was standing under one of the old apple trees, her hands clasped before her, looking up at a single late apple still hanging among the bare branches. She wore a long grey coat over her dress, and her pale hair was uncovered, the breeze stirring it gently. She heard us coming, but did not turn until we were within 3 paces. Monsieur Poirot? Captain Hastings. Mademoiselle, we do not interrupt. You do not interrupt anything, monsieur. I came out only because the house is full of policemen, and I do not like policemen. Few people do. May we walk with you a little? She hesitated, then nodded, and the 3 of us moved slowly along the row, the dew darkening the toes of our shoes. Poirot waited. He had a particular gift, my friend, for letting silence do work which words could not. After perhaps 20 paces, Cecily said without looking at him, "You're going to ask me about the cry." "I am going to ask you about many things, mademoiselle. The cry will be one of them." "I did not hear a cry." I started and looked at Poirot. His face did not change. "You did not hear a cry?" "No, monsieur. I told you last night that I heard a sound which I thought was a cry." That was not the truth. I heard no cry. I had not been in my bed at all. I had been sitting at my window, and from there I saw something, and I came out into the gallery to look, because the gallery window has a better view of the lower garden. "And what did you see, mademoiselle, from your own window?" "I saw a figure cross the lawn, monsieur, from the direction of the orchard towards the house. It was a man. I think it was a man. I could not see his face. He was walking unsteadily." "At what hour?" "At about, I think, a little after 2. "And after he reached the house?" "He went, I think, in by the garden door. I lost sight of him. I rose and put on my dressing gown and went out into the gallery, because from there I might have seen him again as he passed along the lower corridor. But I saw nothing. I waited. I was not brave enough to go down." "And then Captain Hastings opened his door, and you said you had heard a cry." "Yes, monsieur. I lied. I am sorry." "Why did you lie, mademoiselle?" She stopped. She turned to face him fully, and I saw that her eyes, the strange light grey eyes, were full of tears which had not yet fallen. "Monsieur Poirot, I have lived in this house for 12 years. I came here when I was 11. My mother died. My father died. I had no one. Sir Henry took me in, and Lady Margaret has been, kind to me in her way. But I am not Veronica. I am not anyone. I am the ward, the quiet one, the one in the corner. I have learnt over 12 years that the safest thing I can do, when I do not understand what is happening, is to say nothing, or to say what is expected. Last night I did not understand what was happening, so I said what was expected. I said I had heard a cry, because the house had heard a cry, and a person who had not heard a cry would be a person who had to explain herself. I did not wish to explain myself. I am sorry." Poirot regarded her with an expression which I had seen in him only seldom, an expression of something close to tenderness. "Mademoiselle Pell, you have explained yourself now, and you have done it with courage. I thank you. I'm going to ask you, if I may, 2 further questions." "Yes, monsieur." "The figure you saw cross the lawn, how was it dressed?" She closed her eyes, briefly, the better to remember. "In dark clothes, monsieur. A long coat, I think. A hat." "Yes, a hat. A soft hat. The figure was, I think, taller than Mr. Fane." "Taller than Mr. Fane?" "Yes, monsieur, I think so." "You are certain it was a man?" I think it was a man. The walk was a man's walk." "Bien. Une question encore. Why does the library frighten you, mademoiselle?" She drew in her breath sharply. "It does not. Mademoiselle, please." She was silent for a long moment. Then, without looking at him, "Sir Henry died in the library, monsieur, 4 years ago. He was found at the writing table exactly as Mr. Fane was found. Dr. Hare, who was here at the time, signed the certificate. Heart failure, he said. Sir Henry had been ill and was on certain medications, and the strain, there was no inquest. He was buried, and the library was locked, and we never spoke of it. But Lady Margaret has not entered the library since. And neither," she said very quietly. "Have I? You were in the house when Sir Henry died?" "I was in the house, monsieur. I was 19. "And you do not believe he died of heart failure?" She looked up at last. "Monsieur Poirot, I do not know what I believe. I only know that on the night Sir Henry died I heard him quarrelling in the library with someone whose voice I did not recognise. and the next morning he was dead, and no one mentioned the quarrel. And when I asked Lady Margaret whether she had heard it, she did not strike me, you understand. She was kind. She always was kind. She only said, "And Cecily, my dear, you must have dreamed it. It is better to dream than to remember." And so I have tried, for 4 years, to dream rather than to remember. But I have not always succeeded. A silence fell, broken only by a wood pigeon in the trees beyond. "Mademoiselle," said Poirot at last, "you have given me a great deal. I shall not ask you any more this morning, but I shall ask you to be careful. Lock your door tonight. Do not walk in the gallery after dark. Do not on any account go near the library." "Yes, monsieur." Mademoiselle Cecily." He took her hand and bent over it with the formal grace which I had seen him use to duchesses. "You're not in the corner. You're at the centre of this affair, whether you wish it or not. Be brave a little longer." She did not reply, but I saw her hand tremble in his, and then she withdrew it, and turned and walked away down the orchard row, very slowly, like a person walking under a great weight. When she was out of hearing, I said, "Poirot, Sir Henry." "Yes, Hastings. Sir Henry was murdered." "Sir Henry," said Poirot, "may have been murdered. It is a thing we shall have to discover, and if he was, then, mon ami, we are not investigating one murder. We are investigating 2, and the second has been done, perhaps, to conceal the first." He stood looking after Cecily's retreating figure. "And the third, Hastings, we must by all means prevent." Chapter 8. The Doctor's Recollection. Dr. Julian Hare was in the smoking room when we found him, occupying the deepest of the leather chairs and reading of all things a copy of Punch from the previous spring. He looked up as we entered, set the magazine down with the air of a man relieved of a duty, and gestured to the chairs opposite. "Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings, sit. I have been expecting you these 2 hours. You are perceptive. Doctor? I am 65 years old, and I have spent 40 of those years watching faces. When I saw your face this morning, monsieur, I knew it was only a question of when." Poirot settled himself, crossed his legs neatly, and folded his hands. "Doctor, I must ask you to speak to me of the death of Sir Henry Ashgrove." The doctor's face did not change, but he was silent for some moments. He drew out a pipe, filled it, lit it, and only when the bowl was glowing did he speak. "I expected that also. Will you tell me what occurred?" "I will tell you what I told the police, monsieur, and what I told the family, and what I told myself for a long time afterwards. Sir Henry Ashgrove was 63 years old. He had suffered for some 7 years from a chronic complaint of the heart, angina pectoris, with associated weakness of the muscle. I had treated him throughout that period. He took daily a small dose of digitalis. He had been told repeatedly that any severe shock or unusual exertion might prove fatal. He had been seen, only 2 days before his death, by a specialist in London, who confirmed that his condition had recently worsened. On the night of his death, the 17th of November, 4 years ago, Sir Henry retired to the library after dinner, as was his custom to read. He was found at 6:30 the next morning by Pearson, slumped across the writing table, dead. The lamp had burned out. The fire had gone cold. There was no sign of struggle, no sign of injury. I was summoned, examined the body, found no marks, and certified death from cardiac failure. The coroner, who knew Sir Henry's history, accepted the certificate, and there was no inquest. The funeral was 3 days later. And you have always been satisfied with that account? The doctor took the pipe from his mouth and looked at it. No, monsieur, I have not always been satisfied. I have been, let us say, reconciled. Why were you not satisfied? Because, monsieur, when I examined the body, I found upon the writing table a small empty glass tumbler with a residue of liquid in it. The liquid had a faintly sweet smell, which I could not at first place. I asked Pearson what Sir Henry had been drinking. Pearson said Sir Henry had taken his usual whisky and soda after dinner, but had brought nothing into the library. The whisky decanter in the drawing room was untouched after Sir Henry's pour, and yet there was a glass on the table in the library, and a residue. You did not have the residue analysed. I should have done, monsieur, I did not. I will be honest with you. I had been Henry Ashgrove's friend for 40 years. I had loved his wife and family. I knew that he'd been ill, and that any inquiry would distress them, and might raise possibilities I did not wish to consider. I told myself that the glass had been left from earlier in the day, that Pearson was mistaken, that I was imagining a smell that was not there. I signed the certificate. The body was buried. The library was locked. And for 4 years I have told myself that I did the right thing. And do you still tell yourself that? The doctor laid down his pipe. This morning, monsieur, I no longer tell myself anything. I sit in this chair and I think of Anthony Fane on the same writing table. And I think of a small glass beside him. And I think that I have failed in my duty as a physician and as a friend, and that a young man has died because I was too tender of an old man's family. His voice did not break, but his hand, when it returned the pipe to its rack, was unsteady. Poirot said gently, "Doctor, I do not exonerate you. But I will say this. If you had pressed the matter 4 years ago, you would have proved nothing. There would have been no evidence remaining, no analysis possible, no witness willing to speak. The murderer, if there was one, was patient and methodical. You would have failed, and the family would have suffered for nothing. You did perhaps not what was right, but what you could bear. There is a difference, but it is not a great one, and it is one which the law, in its mercy, sometimes acknowledges. You're kind, monsieur. I'm realistic. Now, tell me, doctor, the night Sir Henry died, who was in the house?" Dr. Hare drew a long breath, gathering himself. Lady Margaret. The Colonel. He had returned from India some 6 months previously and was living here. Veronica, who had recently come back from Switzerland. Cecily, who was 19. Stephen Lockwood. Pearson, Mrs. Burling, the staff, and myself. I had come down for the weekend. No other guest? No other guest. And was Sir Henry on good terms with all his family? The doctor hesitated. He was on good terms with Margaret, with Cecily, with Lockwood. He had, that autumn, been quarrelling with Veronica. She had wished to go to London with a friend of whom Sir Henry disapproved, and he had forbidden it. And he had, I will say it, since I have begun, he had, in the last weeks of his life, been engaged in a dispute with his brother Edmund. What was the nature of the dispute? Money, monsieur. Edmund had returned from India with, I believe, less than was supposed. There were debts. He had asked Henry for a loan. Henry had refused. There had been words. The two brothers had not been speaking in any real sense for perhaps a fortnight before Henry's death. And after Henry's death? After Henry's death, Edmund's debts were quietly settled by Lady Margaret out of the income of the estate. The matter was closed. Edmund has lived here since, on the sufferance, one may say, of his sister-in-law. Poirot was silent for a long time. "Doctor," he said at last, "I am going to ask you for one thing more. The cabinet in the library, the one which has been forced. Did Sir Henry keep papers of importance in it?" "He kept his most private papers in it, monsieur, his letters, his diary, the records of certain investments which he did not entrust to Lockwood. After his death, Lady Margaret took the contents of the cabinet and placed them, I believe, in the small safe in her sitting-room. The cabinet itself she left empty. She did not wish, I think, to disturb anything more in that room. And the papers in her sitting-room safe, would they have been considered by anyone valuable? Valuable, monsieur, to whom? To anyone whose interests might have been affected by their existence. Dr. Hare looked at him steadily. "Monsieur Poirot, I am only a country doctor, but I'm not a fool. You are asking me whether the papers in that cabinet might have contained something which would harm a member of this household if it came to light. I am asking that, yes. I have no knowledge of such a paper, but I have always thought, monsieur, I do not know, that Henry, in the last weeks of his life, had become aware of something which troubled him. He was distracted. He spent long hours in the library. He spoke once, at dinner, of having to make a difficult decision. Those were his words. He did not specify. The next week he was dead. Thank you, doctor." We rose. As we reached the door, the doctor said, almost to himself, "He was such a good man, Henry. So decent. If he was murdered, monsieur, I should like to see his murderer hang." "Doctor," said Poirot, "if he was murdered, his murderer is in this house. And his murderer has last night killed again. We shall do what can be done." We left him with his pipe and his memories, and went out into the corridor. The clocks of Ashgrove were striking noon. Chapter 9. A Pair of Garden Boots. It was after luncheon, a luncheon at which Veronica appeared, white and silent, and at which Lady Margaret presided with a brittle composure which had begun, I thought, to crack at the corners. that Poirot drew Inspector Mowbray aside in the morning room and laid before him 3 things: the small horn button from the orchard gate, the fragment of paper from Anthony Fane's hand, and the discrepancy in the rent book ledger. The inspector listened, made notes, examined the button under a strong reading glass and pronounced it interesting. "From a gentleman's overcoat, that is, sir. Dark grey or brown horn, with 3 holes. Common enough pattern, but distinctive shape. We'll want to see every overcoat in the house." "I had hoped you would say so. Pearson can show us the cloakroom by the garden door, where most of the gentlemen hang their outdoor things." The cloakroom was a small flagged chamber off the back hall, with hooks along one wall and a row of low boxes for boots beneath. There were some 7 or 8 overcoats hanging, gentlemen's, ladies', and one which appeared to belong to a labourer and was probably the gardener's. Pearson identified each. "This is, sir, was Mr. Fane's, sir, the brown ulster." The inspector lifted it down. We examined it, button by button. "All present, sir, none missing." "Bien." "This is Colonel Ashgrove's, the dark green tweed." We examined it. All buttons present. "Dr. Hare's, the black overcoat." All present. "Mr. Lockwood's, the grey." All present. The inspector, who had been holding the small horn button against each coat in turn, shook his head. "Doesn't match any of them, sir. Different size." "Mademoiselle Veronica's coats?" There were 2, both with cloth-covered buttons. Lady Margaret's were the same. "Mademoiselle Pell's?" "Miss Pell hasn't an outdoor coat that hangs here, sir. She keeps her one coat in her own room." "Indeed." The inspector sat back on his heels by the boot box. "Whose coat does this button come from, then? Not from any in this room." "Or," said Poirot very quietly, "from a coat which is no longer in this room." He bent down to the boot box. There were 6 pairs of boots and shoes, Wellingtons, brogues, walking shoes, each, in the manner of country houses, neatly cleaned and arranged. He went through them one by one. Tiens, Inspector, look at this." He drew out a pair of stout brown country boots, of size perhaps 9, with leather soles. He turned them over. The soles were clean. Too clean, I thought, looking at the others. The Colonel's brogues bore traces of yesterday's gravel. Even Pearson's plain black walking shoes had a smudge of garden mud on the heel. "Whose are these, Pearson?" Pearson bent. "Those are Mr. Lockwood's, sir. He keeps a pair down here for going across to the cottage in wet weather, though he has another pair at the cottage as well." "When were these last cleaned, do you know?" "I clean them, sir, when they want it. I should say these were cleaned 4 or 5 days ago. Mr. Lockwood has not used them, to my knowledge, since. And yet, Pearson, observe." Poirot held one boot up to the light. "There is, on the inside of the heel, here, a faint smear of earth which has not been wiped away. Wet earth. Fresh earth. You see?" Pearson peered. "I see it now, sir. I had not noticed." "You would not have noticed. It is a small thing. It says only that someone has worn this boot very recently and has wiped it clean afterwards, but has missed this small place. Whoever cleaned it did not wish to be seen to have used the boot. Voilà." "Mr. Lockwood, then," said the inspector, his voice neutral, "or someone who wished it to appear to be Mr. Lockwood." The inspector and I looked at each other. "What size are Mr. Lockwood's feet?" 9, sir, or thereabouts. "And Colonel Ashgrove?" 10, sir. Mr. Fane was. 9.5, sir. The inspector wrote in his notebook. Poirot replaced the boot and stood. "Inspector, may I beg one further indulgence? I wish to see the sitting room of Lady Margaret and her safe, in her presence and yours." "Certainly, sir." Lady Margaret, when we put the request to her, agreed without hesitation. Her sitting room was small, blue-papered, with a tall window overlooking the rose garden. The safe was set into the wall behind a portrait of a Cavalier ancestor. She opened the portrait on its hinge, turned the dial, and swung the iron door wide. Inside were several leather-bound boxes, a small jewel case, and a stack of envelopes secured with green tape. "The envelopes, monsieur, contain my husband's papers from the library cabinet. I removed them after his death." "Have you opened them since?" "No, monsieur. I've not had the heart." "May we open them now?" "You may." Poirot took the stack with great care. He cut the tape. He laid the envelopes upon the writing table and went through them one by one, with Lady Margaret and the inspector at his elbow. Letters from old friends, investment certificates, a diary of game bags from 20 years past, a folder of correspondence relating to the Cairo affair, which Poirot lingered over with a small smile of recollection. And then, near the bottom, a long envelope of grey paper, sealed with red wax bearing Sir Henry's monogram. Poirot held it up. "This, Lady Margaret, has not been opened since your husband sealed it. I have never seen it before, monsieur. With your permission." He broke the seal. He drew out a folded sheet of paper covered in Sir Henry's handwriting. Dated the 11th of November, 6 days before his death. He read it through. His face, as he read, became very still. He read it through a second time. Then, without speaking, he handed it to the inspector. The inspector read it. His mouth tightened. He passed it to Lady Margaret, whose hand, when she took it, trembled. I read it last, over her shoulder. It was a short statement in Sir Henry's clear hand, declaring that he had become aware that his secretary, Mr. Stephen Lockwood, had been, over a period of some 3 years, systematically falsifying the rent book entries of the home farms and converting the difference to his own use, to a total which Sir Henry estimated to date at not less than £2,000. The statement went on to say that Sir Henry intended, after careful reflection, to dismiss Lockwood and to recover what could be recovered, but that he had decided to do this quietly without prosecution, in consideration of 15 years of service and of his own affection for the man. The statement concluded, "I have not yet spoken to Lockwood. I shall do so on Monday next, the 18th. If anything should happen to me before that date, this paper is to serve as my testament against him." H.A. The 18th of November had been the day after Sir Henry's death. Lady Margaret sat down very slowly in the chair by the writing-table. "Stephen," she said. "Stephen?" "Lady Margaret," said Poirot gently, "I beg you do not yet draw conclusions. The paper tells us only what your husband intended. It does not tell us what was done. We must, however, speak to Mr. Lockwood before the day is out." He glanced at the inspector. The inspector nodded once and rose. "With your permission, Lady Margaret, I shall send for him now." But Lady Margaret was no longer listening. She sat with the paper in her lap looking at it, and her face had upon it the expression of a woman who has lifted a stone and found, beneath it, not what she had feared, but something altogether worse. Chapter 10. A Dispute Among the Roses. We did not, however, send for Stephen Lockwood at once. As we left Lady Margaret's sitting room, Poirot laid a hand upon the inspector's sleeve and drew him aside in the corridor. "Inspector, a moment. Before we speak with Mr. Lockwood, I should like to allow him a little further time to, let us say, develop. I shall meantime speak with 2 other persons, the Colonel and Mademoiselle Veronica. They have been spared until now, but I shall spare them no longer, and you will, perhaps, take this opportunity to make certain inquiries in the village regarding the visits, if any, which Mr. Anthony Fane may have paid there before yesterday." "In the village, sir?" "In the village, Inspector. A young man does not, as a rule, come to a country house for a single weekend without first establishing certain contacts. I have a feeling, only a feeling, that Mr. Fane was perhaps not as much of a stranger to Ashgrove as our hostess supposed. I'll go directly, sir. And the constable, let him remain at the house, with instructions to permit no one to depart." "Understood, sir." The inspector went. Poirot turned to me. "Hastings, find me the Colonel." The Colonel was found in the rose garden, where he had been engaged, with a pair of secateurs and a fine disregard for the season, in the cutting back of a small standard rose. He looked up at our approach with the expression of a man who has been waiting, with diminishing patience, for an interview which he knows must come. "Monsieur Poirot, Captain, I imagine you wish to speak with me." "If you will permit it, Colonel." "Walk with me then, if you will. I find I think more clearly when my hands are occupied." We walked slowly between the long beds of dormant roses. The Colonel pruned as we walked with quick, small clips. The cuttings fell at his feet and he did not pick them up. "Colonel Ashgrove," began Poirot, "I shall be direct with you, since I think you would wish it. Last night a young man was murdered in this house. The young man was, by all accounts, engaged to your daughter. Although the engagement was not formal, he was a man of whom you, I have been told, did not approve. May I ask you why?" The Colonel snipped a branch with a small, precise click. "I did not approve of him, monsieur, because he was a fortune hunter. You knew this?" "I suspected it. I have lived with Anglo-Indian society for 30 years, monsieur, and I know the type. He attached himself to my daughter at a country house in August. Since that time he had cultivated her with what I considered indecent assiduity. He had no profession to speak of. His novel writing was a pretext. He had debts. I made certain inquiries through a friend in London. What did your inquiries reveal? They revealed that he owed a little under £3,000, principally to gambling acquaintances and to his tailor, and that he had, twice in the past 5 years, made, let us say, advances to other young women of substantial means, neither of which had culminated in an engagement, but each of which had concluded with financial assistance, shall we call it, from the lady's family. He had been paid off. And you intended to do the same? I intended to do whatever was necessary to prevent the marriage. I had not yet decided upon the means. Did your daughter know of these inquiries? She did not. I had hoped before the visit to confront him with them privately, and to persuade him to withdraw of his own accord. I should then have told Veronica, in a manner calculated to wound her pride least. I am not, he snipped, an entirely cold man, monsieur, although I am sometimes thought so. And did you confront him? The colonel paused in his pruning. He turned to face Poirot fully, and his moustaches bristled. Yes, monsieur, I confronted him. When? Yesterday afternoon, in the gun-room, before tea. I told him that I knew of his debts, of his prior engagements, and that if he persisted in his attentions to my daughter, I should ensure that my brother's testamentary arrangements, of which he had no doubt been made aware, were enforced to their full extent, with the result that, even should he marry her, he should obtain at most £5,000, of which he would owe more than half before the wedding bells had ceased to ring. And how did he respond? He laughed, monsieur. He laughed. He said that I had underestimated the situation, and that there were factors in this household which I knew nothing of. He said that he was in possession of certain information, which would, if he chose to disclose it, alter the testamentary arrangements very considerably indeed. He said that, on his marriage to Veronica, he should expect, these were his words, a great deal more than £5,000, and from a great deal more than one source. He attempted blackmail, of me, monsieur, in the first instance, but his words made it plain that the blackmail was directed beyond me, at others in this household. Did he name any name? He did not, but the inference was unavoidable. What did you say? I said, said the colonel very evenly, that I should consider his words, and that I should give him my answer the next day. I left him in the gun-room. I went to my study. I sat there, monsieur, for perhaps 2 hours, in a state which I shall not attempt to describe, and then I dressed for dinner. You did not communicate the substance of this conversation to anyone else in the house? I did not, monsieur. I had not decided upon my course. And last night, after you retired, you remained in your room? I remained in my room. Poirot was silent for some paces. Colonel Ashgrove, I am going to ask you a question which is grave, and I beg you to consider it before you answer. The information which Mr. Fane claimed to possess. Have you any idea what it might have been? The colonel pruned. His face was set and grey. Monsieur Poirot, I'm not a clever man. I'm a soldier. I see what is in front of me. I have lived in this house for 4 years since my brother's death, and I have observed certain things, and I have set them aside because to consider them would have been disloyal to my brother's memory, to my sister-in-law's peace, to the family name. Last night, when Mr. Fane was killed, I knew that I should not be permitted to set those things aside any longer. Will you tell me? I will tell you this, monsieur. My brother in the last weeks of his life was a deeply troubled man. I came home from India in the May of that year, and I saw him often. In October he became more troubled still. He spoke to me only once of having discovered a betrayal within his own household. He did not name the person. He said only that he was not yet certain, and that until he was certain he would say nothing. A fortnight later he was dead. And you did nothing? I did nothing, monsieur. Margaret was prostrated. The doctor signed the certificate. I told myself it was the heart, as the doctor said. I told myself that, whatever my brother had discovered, it had died with him. And then, last night, Anthony Fane spoke of information, of more than one source, and I knew, monsieur, that my brother's discovery had not died with him, that someone else in this house knew it also, and had perhaps known it then, and had perhaps— He could not finish. He turned away and bent over the rose and clipped very precisely a single dead bud. "Monsieur," he said, his back to us, "I did not kill Anthony Fane, but I am perhaps the only man in this house who can say with truth that he wished him dead. I shall not pretend otherwise." "Colonel," said Poirot gently, "thank you for your honesty. I shall require you, please, to remain in the house and grounds until further notice. Inspector Mowbray will likely wish to speak with you again. I shall be at his disposal, monsieur." We left him among his roses. As we walked back to the house, Poirot was silent. Only when we reached the terrace did he speak. "Hastings, the Colonel has given us, perhaps without intending to, the shape of the affair." "What shape?" "There was, 4 years ago, a betrayal in this house. Sir Henry discovered it. Sir Henry died before he could act upon his discovery. The discovery in some form survived him. Anthony Fane by some means learned of it. Anthony Fane attempted to use it. Anthony Fane is dead. Eh bien, the question is no longer whether the betrayer is in this house. The question is who the betrayer is, and how Anthony Fane learned of him, and how Anthony Fane was, in his turn, silenced." "Lockwood, surely. The rent book—" "The rent book is part of it, Hastings, but not perhaps all of it. A man does not commit 2 murders for the sake of £2,000. He may commit one, perhaps in panic, but the second is committed for something more. For what then? For survival, mon ami. For the survival of the life he has built upon the first crime. That, in my experience, is the most dangerous motive of all. And the man who is moved by it is the most dangerous criminal, because he has nothing left to lose." Chapter 11. Veronica and the Letter. Veronica Ashgrove received us in the small sitting room at the head of the south wing stairs, a feminine, comfortable room scattered with books and magazines, with a bowl of late chrysanthemums on the table by the window. She sat on the window seat, her feet drawn up beneath her, in a dark woolen dress that made her face look paler still. She did not rise when we entered, but gestured with a small weary motion of her hand to 2 chairs. "Monsieur Poirot, I've been told I'm to expect you. Sit down. Will you have coffee? I cannot face it myself, but Janet has brought a pot." "You are most kind, mademoiselle. Captain Hastings will accept, I'm sure." I accepted. Janet the maid, a brisk, tidy woman of perhaps 40, with steady hands and an inscrutable face, poured me a cup, gave a short bob, and withdrew. "Mademoiselle," began Poirot when the door had closed, "I shall be brief, and I shall be unkind. Forgive me. The matter requires it." "I expect nothing else, monsieur." "Did you know that Anthony Fane was a fortune hunter, with debts, and with 2 prior, let us say, entanglements, each of which had been resolved by payment?" She did not flinch. Her eyes did not leave his. "I knew about the debts, monsieur. I did not know about the prior entanglements. My father told me about them this morning. And the debts. How did you know?" "Because Anthony told me. He told me in August. He told me he had nothing. No profession, no prospects, £3,000 of debts. He said he would understand if I never spoke to him again. Instead, I told him that none of it mattered, and I asked him to marry me." "You asked him?" "Yes, monsieur, I asked him. He had not the courage. I had. I have always had, in such matters, more courage than I have had since. Mademoiselle, last night at dinner you said he had told you in the morning that he wished to break the engagement, because there was someone else." "That is what I said, monsieur." "Was it true?" She closed her eyes briefly. "It was partly true. He had told me yesterday morning that there was a difficulty. He had not used the words, someone else. He had said that there was a complication which had arisen, and which he would explain to me by the end of the weekend. I, in my distress, I supposed it must be a woman. Last night I told you what I had supposed, not what he had said. I am sorry. What do you now think the complication was?" I think it had to do with the conversation he had with my father, in the gun-room before tea." "Your father told you of that conversation?" "He told me an hour ago, monsieur. He thought I should know." "And what is your conclusion?" She drew a long breath. "My conclusion, monsieur, is that Anthony was preparing to do something disgraceful. I had thought, since this morning, that perhaps he had loved me less than I had supposed, and that he had been only a fortune hunter from the beginning. Now I am uncertain. I think it is possible that he loved me in his way. I think it is also possible that he was prepared to do something for which I should have despised him. in order to be able to marry me without the diminution of fortune which my grandfather's clause would have entailed. I do not know, monsieur, whether I am more grieved that he is dead, or that I shall never know which Antony he was." There was a silence. Even Poirot, I thought, did not at once know what to say. At length he spoke very gently. "Mademoiselle, I shall ask you one further thing. Yesterday evening, after Lady Margaret retired, you and Mr. Fane sat by the long window, and he spoke of taking a turn in the garden." "Yes." "Did he speak of meeting anyone?" "He did not, monsieur. But I have wondered since." "Wondered what?" "Wondered whether, when he went out by the garden door, he went to meet someone whom he had arranged to meet. He had been distracted all evening." His hand kept going to his breast pocket as though to a paper there. I noticed it, but I attached no importance to it at the time. "A paper? Tiens! Mademoiselle, did he have a paper upon him at dinner?" "I think so, monsieur. I thought it must be a letter." Poirot was silent for some moments. Then he said, "Mademoiselle, I am going to ask you a thing which is delicate. The night your uncle, Sir Henry, died, you were in this house. You were 19. Do you recall anything of that night?" The colour, what little there was of it, drained from her face. "Why do you ask, monsieur?" "Because I begin to think that the death of Anthony Fane is connected with the death of your uncle. Because I think that a person in this house knows what happened on that night, 4 years ago, and has acted to ensure that no one else shall ever know." She was silent for a long time. When she spoke at last, it was very quietly. "Monsieur Poirot, I shall tell you something that I have never told anyone. On the night my uncle died, I went down to the library at about 11:15. I'd quarrelled with him at dinner, as Dr. Hare may have told you. I wished to apologise. I went to the library door. I was about to knock, and then I heard voices." "Whose voices?" "My uncle's, and another, a man's. They were quarrelling. The other man was— I could not at first place it. The voice was low. I stood there, monsieur, with my hand raised, and listened. After perhaps a minute the other man laughed, a short, ugly laugh, and then I heard him say, very clearly, 'You will do nothing of the kind, Henry, because you have not the proof, and you will never have the proof.' And then I turned and went back upstairs, and the next morning my uncle was dead." "You did not see the other man?" "I did not see him." "Did you tell anyone what you had heard?" "I told no one, monsieur. I was 19. I had been quarrelling with my uncle. He was dead. I thought that anything I said would only complicate the grief. I told myself I had imagined the quarrel. After the funeral I told myself I had dreamed it." "And the voice, mademoiselle? Have you, in the 4 years since, recognised the voice?" She was a long time answering. When she did, her voice was so quiet that I had to lean forward to hear it. "I have, monsieur. I recognised it the day after the funeral, when I heard him reading the morning prayers. But I did not allow myself to know that I had recognised it. I unrecognised it, monsieur, if you understand me." "Whose voice was it, mademoiselle?" She looked at him, and her eyes were dry and very steady. "It was Stephen Lockwood's, monsieur." The clock on the mantel ticked, and ticked, and ticked. Poirot did not move. "Mademoiselle Veronica," he said at last, "why this morning do you tell me?" "Because Anthony is dead, monsieur. Because I think Anthony was killed for the same reason my uncle was killed, although I do not know the reason. Because I have been silent for 4 years, and my silence has cost a man his life, and I shall not be silent any longer." She rose. She crossed to the writing desk, opened a drawer, and took out a small folded paper, much creased, as though it had been carried for a long time. "Monsieur Poirot, the morning after my uncle's funeral I went to the library. The door was locked, but the cabinet at the far end, the cabinet which has now been forced, was, then, only closed, not locked. I opened it. I do not know why. I think I wished to feel close to my uncle. Inside, on the lower shelf, I found a scrap of paper, a torn corner. I took it. I have kept it." She handed it to Poirot. He unfolded it. I leaned over his shoulder. The paper was old, yellowed at the edges. Upon it was written, in Sir Henry's hand, "And the entries for August, September and October of this current year are confirmed by my own examination to be falsified, the true sum being not less than £73 in each month, the difference having been received by S.L." The writing broke off where the paper was torn. "Mademoiselle, you knew?" "I knew, monsieur, that the paper concerned Stephen. I did not know what it concerned. I did not understand the figures. I only knew that I had heard Stephen quarrelling with my uncle, and that here was a paper written by my uncle concerning Stephen. I kept it. I did not know what to do with it. I have lived with it for 4 years. Poirot folded the paper very gently and placed it in his breast pocket. Mademoiselle, you have done, at last, exactly what is right. I shall not detain you further. I beg you to remain in your room and to lock your door. Monsieur Poirot. She caught at his sleeve as he turned to go. Anthony had been in this room 2 days ago. He had been at this writing desk. I had left him here, alone, while I went down to fetch a book. Could he have found... Mademoiselle, did the drawer in which you kept the paper have a key? It had a key, but the key was in the drawer. Poirot inclined his head gravely. Then yes, mademoiselle, he could have found it. And I think that very probably he did. We left her standing by the writing desk, looking down at the empty drawer, and her face, as I last saw it, was the face of a woman who has just understood, 4 years too late, the price of a silence she had thought was kind. Chapter 12. Mr. Lockwood receives a visit. Inspector Mowbray, when he returned from the village at 4:30, had matters of his own to report. He found Poirot in the drawing-room, at the small writing table by the window, arranging upon the green leather a series of small objects: the horn button, the torn fragment of paper from Anthony Fane's hand, the older, larger fragment which Veronica had given him, the smear of dried mud he had collected from the library carpet, and a slip of paper upon which he had written the times of the previous night. Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings, I have news. You have been to the village. Tell me. I went first to the inn, the Ashgrove Arms. The landlord remembers Mr. Fane well. He was in the snug bar twice last week, Tuesday and Thursday, drinking, and on each occasion he was in conversation with a man whom the landlord did not know. A man, sir, of middle height, well-dressed, dark, quiet manner. Mr. Lockwood, I should say, by the description, although the landlord wouldn't swear to it not having seen Mr. Lockwood up close. Tiens. On Friday, sir, Mr. Fane was in the village again, this time at the post office, where he sent off a registered letter. The postmistress remembers it because it was registered, and she remembers the address. It went to a firm of solicitors in London, Messrs. Charteris and Pole, of Bedford Row. Anthony Fane was then in correspondence with solicitors. Bien. And lastly, sir, I made inquiry at the railway station. The station master recalls that Mr. Fane arrived on Friday afternoon, but that he had been expected at Ashgrove Castle on Saturday. That is to say, the day after his actual arrival. He stayed Friday night at the Ashgrove Arms, and only came up to the castle on Saturday morning. He arrived a day early. He spent his first night in the village. He met a man, perhaps Lockwood, at the inn. He posted a letter to solicitors. Et puis he came to the house on the appointed day, as if he had only just arrived. Poirot's eyes had taken on the bright, slightly absent look which I knew to mean that the pieces of the puzzle were beginning, in his mind, to assemble themselves. Inspector, did the postmistress remember when on Friday the letter was posted? At 4:20, sir. And the conversation at the inn, the second one Thursday, at what hour? Late evening, sir, around 8. So, Thursday evening Mr. Fane meets a man at the inn. Friday afternoon he posts a letter to solicitors. Saturday morning he comes to the house. Sunday, that is last night, he is killed. Voyons. Inspector, we shall now speak with Mr. Lockwood. But before we do, I beg you to send a wire, at once, to Messrs. Charteris and Pole, requesting that they advise us by return of the contents of any correspondence received from a Mr. Anthony Fane in the past week. The wire to be sent in your name as Inspector of the Suffolk Constabulary, with a reference to the present investigation. Right, sir. And the constable at the door, he has continued to ensure that no one departs. Yes, sir. And Mr. Lockwood is in his office, sir, when I came in. The constable saw him go up after luncheon, and he has not come down. Bon, allons. But when, after the wire had been dispatched, we ascended to the secretary's office, we found the door locked. The inspector knocked. There was no reply. He knocked a second time, more forcefully. Mr. Lockwood, Inspector Mowbray, open the door, if you please. Silence. The inspector and I looked at one another. Poirot's face had gone very still. Pearson, he called sharply. The butler, who had been hovering at the head of the stair, came forward. "Pearson, the master key for these doors." "I have it, sir." He produced a ring of keys, selected one and turned it in the lock. The door opened. The room was empty, or rather, it was empty of Stephen Lockwood. Upon the long baize table the ledger still lay open. The roll-top desk stood closed. The window stood open, only an inch, but unmistakably open, where it had been shut when we had left earlier. And upon the desk, weighted by the glass paperweight, was a single envelope addressed in Lockwood's small precise hand to Hercule Poirot, Esquire. Poirot took it up very deliberately. He slit it open with his penknife, drew out a single sheet of paper, and read. I read over his shoulder. The note was brief. "Monsieur Poirot, you will conclude when you find this that I am the murderer of Anthony Fane, and you will be partly correct. I poisoned him in the library last night. I shall not attempt to defend or to explain. I have left certain papers in the safe in this room, which will, I think, satisfy the police regarding the rent book entries. The combination is written below. I am sorry in particular for the sorrow I have caused Lady Margaret. She does not deserve it. None of them do. Stephen Lockwood." Beneath the signature, a series of figures. The safe combination. The inspector swore, briefly and with feeling. Poirot did not move. He stood with the letter in his hand, and his eyes were fixed not upon the letter, but upon the open window beyond. "Inspector, the grounds, at once, every constable, the cottage at the drive end and the lake and the orchard. He cannot have been gone above an hour. Vite." The inspector was already at the door. "Wait," Poirot raised his hand. "Wait, Inspector. One moment. The letter says that Mr. Lockwood is the murderer of Anthony Fane, and that he is partly correct. Sir, read again, you will conclude when you find this that I am the murderer of Anthony Fane, and you will be partly correct. It is a curious phrase. He's confessing, sir, and qualifying. He is qualifying, Inspector. Yes. He says he poisoned Mr. Fane in the library. He does not say he struck him. He does not say he tore the paper from his hand. He does not say he is the murderer of Sir Henry. He says only that he is partly the murderer of Anthony Fane. Sir, with respect, we'll have time to pass his prose when we've found him. You are right, Inspector. Forgive me. Allez." The inspector ran. Pearson followed with the keys. We heard the bell ringing through the house, and the rush of the constable's boots in the hall below, and the sound of the front door opening and the cry going up across the lawns. Poirot did not move. He stood at the desk holding the letter. Hastings. Yes, this letter. It is in Mr. Lockwood's hand. There is no doubt of that. None. And yet, mon ami, I do not believe it. You don't believe he wrote it? I believe he wrote it. I do not believe what it says. He's confessed. He has confessed, Hastings, to one thing in order to conceal another. Observe, he confesses to the murder of Anthony Fane. He does not confess to anything else. He does not confess, for example, to the murder of Sir Henry. Yet we have between us the testimony of Mademoiselle Veronica, who heard him quarrelling with Sir Henry on the night of Sir Henry's death. We have the paper in Sir Henry's hand, accusing him of falsified accounts. We have the rent book entry in 2 inks. If he is the man who killed Anthony Fane to protect his earlier crime, would he not in his last letter confess to the earlier crime as well? Would he not, in despair, in flight, in the wreck of his life, at last be honest? Perhaps he didn't kill Sir Henry. Perhaps it really was the heart. Perhaps. But there is something else, Hastings. Look at this. He laid the letter upon the desk and indicated a single line. I am sorry, in particular for the sorrow I have caused Lady Margaret. Yes. Hastings. This is a man who has, on his own confession, destroyed £2,000 of his employer's wealth, who has murdered a guest in her house, who has fled into the night, leaving her to face the consequences, and his apology is for the sorrow, not for the theft, not for the murder, pour le chagrin, for her grief. He was fond of her. He was, Hastings, in love with her. I stared at him. In love? With Lady Margaret? Did you not see it, mon ami? When he speaks of her, his voice changes. When she enters a room, his eyes follow her without his seeming to know it. The 15 years of service, the cottage at the drive end. The man has loved her for half his life, silently, without hope. That is the truth of Stephen Lockwood, and it changes everything. Then, what does it mean? It means, Hastings, that he is a man capable of great loyalty and great silence and great sacrifice. It means that if he believed Lady Margaret to be threatened, he would do whatever was required to protect her, even to confess to a murder he did not commit. He didn't kill Anthony Fane. I do not say that, Hastings. He may have. He may have been partly the murderer, as he says, having poisoned the cyanide, having admitted Mr. Fane to the library. But the blow on the temple, the tearing of the paper from the hand, those were not, I think, his work. Those, my friend, were the work of another, and Stephen Lockwood, in writing this letter and in vanishing from this house, has placed himself between us and the other. He has confessed in order that we shall search no further. Then who? I shall not yet say. Hastings. Inspector Mowbray will not, I think, find Mr. Lockwood. Mr. Lockwood is gone, and Mr. Lockwood, I suspect, intends to remain gone, alive or dead, that we shall see. Meanwhile, we have, by his very flight, been given the gift of motion. The household, until this hour, has been holding its breath. Now it will exhale. The murderer, the true murderer, will believe himself safe. He will relax. He will perhaps make some small mistake. And when he does, mon ami, we shall be ready. He folded the letter carefully and put it in his pocket. He turned to the safe on the wall. And meanwhile, he said, let us see what Mr. Lockwood has left for us in his safe. He opened it with the combination. Inside were the false ledgers. Lockwood had been keeping 2 sets, one truthful, one falsified, bound together with a brief written account of the deception, signed and dated. The total embezzled over 4 years came to £2,400. There was something else also, a small square envelope sealed, addressed in Lockwood's hand to Lady Margaret Ashgrove. Personal. Poirot weighed it in his hand for a moment, then he laid it down upon the safe. This, Hastings, is not for us. This is a private letter from a man to the woman he has loved in silence for 15 years. We shall give it to her, unopened, when this is over. She has earned the right. He closed the safe. We went down. Through the long windows of the corridor we could see, in the failing afternoon light, the figures of the constables moving across the lawns and into the orchard, and the village men whom Inspector Mowbray had hastily summoned, with their dogs, working along the river path. It was nearly dark when, at the far end of the lake where the Ashgrove stream broadened into a shallow weir, one of the dogs began to bark, and a constable's whistle blew 3 times, sharply, against the cold evening air. Chapter 13. The Body in the Reeds. They brought Stephen Lockwood up to the boathouse on a hurdle. He had been found face down in the reeds at the edge of the weir, half submerged, his coat heavy with water. There was no obvious mark upon him. Dr. Hare, summoned by a running boy, was already there when Poirot and I arrived, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, his hands at the dead man's throat. He has been in the water perhaps 2 hours, monsieur, no more. Dead before or after he entered the water. The doctor lifted Lockwood's head, examined the back of the skull with careful fingers, parted the wet hair. There is a contusion here, monsieur, at the base of the skull, sufficient to stun, possibly sufficient to kill. The water would have done the rest, if he were not already dead. He did not then simply walk into the weir and drown himself. He did not, monsieur. He may have walked in, but he was struck before or as he entered. The bruise is fresh and deep. Inspector Mowbray, who had been giving directions to his men, came up to us, his face set. Monsieur Poirot, this is bad. It is very bad, Inspector. But it is, I confess, what I have been afraid of since the moment we read his letter. Mr. Lockwood was not running away, Inspector. He was being run. What do you mean, sir? I mean that Mr. Lockwood left his office by the window at some hour after we left him this morning. He went down through the kitchen garden. There is a path which avoids the front of the house, and he took the lower track to the lake. He had an appointment, I believe, with the murderer. He intended, perhaps, to deliver some confrontation, some last warning. He arrived at the weir. He was struck from behind. He fell, or was pushed, into the water. Voila. Why would he go to meet the murderer alone? Because, Inspector, he believed that he could control the murderer, and because he could not, in his own conception of honour, betray the murderer to the police. Stephen Lockwood was a man of complicated loyalties. He had loved Lady Margaret for 15 years. He had also, 4 years ago, become, let us say, complicit in the death of Sir Henry. He had embezzled funds, yes, but he had not, I think, killed Sir Henry. The killer of Sir Henry was another. Lockwood, however, had reason to suspect that other, and reasons, perhaps obligation, to keep silent. He was, mon ami, the man who held the keys to all the doors in this affair in his head as well as in his pocket, and tonight, when he saw that the truth was breaking over the household, he went to the murderer and said— Poirot raised his small hands. "Enough, no more. I have written my confession. I shall take this upon myself. But you will leave the others alone, and you will go away." That, I believe, was his offer. The murderer accepted the offer. The murderer accepted it with a blow at the base of the skull, and a body in the weir, and the further conviction in our minds that the case was closed. The inspector looked down at the dead man. "Then who, sir? Who in that house?" "That, Inspector, we must now decide, and decide quickly. The murderer believes himself safe. He will believe Mr. Lockwood's letter has done its work. We must ensure that this belief continues for one further evening. Inspector, listen to me carefully. You will arrange for the body to be removed quietly by the lower path to the village. You will not announce it to the household. You will, when you return to the house, tell the company that Mr. Lockwood has not been found, that the search continues, and that we have reason to believe that he has fled the country by motor car. You will speak in a tone of professional disappointment. You will encourage them to retire early, since tomorrow will bring further inquiries. And then, sir? And then, Inspector, we shall set our trap." "What sort of trap?" Poirot smiled, a small, cold smile which I had seen perhaps 3 times in our long acquaintance. "The kind of trap, Inspector, in which the bait is the truth, and the bell that rings is the murderer's own conscience. I shall require, please, the cooperation of Lady Margaret, of Captain Hastings, of yourself, and of Mademoiselle Cecily Pell. I shall require also a particular object from the library, and the hours after dinner, and a fire. I shall ask of you nothing else. Will you give me until midnight?" "You shall have until midnight, sir." "And one further thing, Inspector. The wire to Charteris and Pole. Have you had the reply?" The inspector reached into his pocket and produced a yellow telegram form. "It came through 15 minutes ago, sir. I had not yet shown it you." Poirot read it. He read it a second time, then slowly he folded it and handed it back. "Yes," he said. "Yes, I had thought so. Inspector, this is the linchpin. With this, all is clear. We have only to set the play, and call the players and let them speak their lines. Hastings, à la maison." The inspector did not show me the wire. As we walked back across the dark lawns, I asked Poirot what it had said. It said, "Hastings," what I had been waiting for it to say. Anthony Fane wrote to Charteris and Pole on Friday afternoon, posting from the village. He wrote to inquire whether they would represent him in a matter of pressing a private claim, the substance of which he sketched in outline. The substance of the claim, mon ami, was the assertion that Sir Henry Ashgrove had not died of natural causes, that he had been murdered, that the murderer was a member of the Ashgrove household, and that Mr. Fane was in possession of evidence to that effect, which he proposed, if the family did not come to a satisfactory accommodation, to present to the public prosecutor. But this is what we already supposed. Yes, Hastings, but here is the addition. The wire from Charteris and Pole concludes, and they were professional enough to give us this without prevarication, that Mr. Fane's letter named the person whom he believed to have killed Sir Henry, and the person was not Stephen Lockwood. Then who? That Hastings you shall hear in the drawing-room at 9:30, when Hercule Poirot tells the truth, and the truth tells back. Chapter 14. A Gathering by Firelight. Dinner that evening was, in the manner of meals in stricken houses, both shorter and longer than it had any right to be. Lady Margaret presided in black. The Colonel ate methodically and in silence. Veronica did not eat. Cecily ate a little, and once, when Pearson brought in the savoury, lifted her eyes and looked steadily at Poirot, as though seeking some signal. Dr. Hare carried the conversation almost alone, with reminiscences of an Italian holiday some years past which no one heard. Inspector Mowbray had already given the household his prepared piece. That Mr. Lockwood, it appeared, had taken the 8:30 motor coach from the crossroads 2 miles away. That telephone descriptions had gone to the ports, and that the search would be long, but the case was, in his view, drawing to a close. The household received this with relief, which in some was visible and in others was concealed. But in every face about the table I saw, after Mowbray's words, a small perceptible loosening, as though a wire that had bound them all had at last been cut. Poirot drank a single glass of claret slowly, and observed. When the cloth was drawn, he rose and asked Lady Margaret if he might detain the company in the drawing-room for half an hour, since there were certain matters which Inspector Mowbray felt should be, formally, concluded before the guests retired. Lady Margaret bowed her head. Of course, Monsieur Poirot. The drawing-room had been prepared. Pearson had built up the fire to a great blaze, and the curtains had been drawn, and the lamps lit only at the room's centre so that the corners stood in shadow. The constable was at the door in plain clothes. He might have been a footman. Inspector Mowbray was at the smaller writing table by the window, where he had laid out his notebook and a small stack of papers. Poirot took his stand very quietly before the fire, his back to the great mantel. "My friends, you will, I beg, take the seats which I have arranged. Lady Margaret, here by the fire. Colonel, opposite. Mademoiselle Veronica, beside your father, if you please. Mademoiselle Cecily, here, on this small chair on my left hand. Dr. Sustus, there. Captain Hastings, you will sit beside the inspector. Bon." We arranged ourselves. The arrangement, I noticed, placed Cecily nearest to Poirot, with a clear line of sight to every other face. The inspector and I were to one side, slightly behind the others. Poirot waited until the small stir of seating had subsided. Then he began. "My friends, I shall not waste your time. You have been told this evening that Mr. Stephen Lockwood has fled the country. This is a fiction, which Inspector Mowbray and I considered necessary for the events of the past 24 hours. Mr. Lockwood has not fled. He has been found, 3 hours ago, dead, in the weir at the foot of the Ashgrove lake. He was struck on the back of the head, and either fell or was pushed into the water. He did not die by his own hand." A movement, like a small wind, ran around the room. Lady Margaret's hand went to her throat. The colonel half rose, sat down again. Veronica gave a little sound which she at once stifled. Cecily did not move. Dr. Hare's face went grey. "Stephen, dead?" Lady Margaret's voice was almost inaudible. "Stephen is dead, madame. I'm very sorry. I shall return to him in a moment. But before I speak of his death, I must speak of 2 other deaths, which preceded it. The death of Mr. Anthony Fane last night in the library, and the death of Sir Henry Ashgrove 4 years ago in the same library. For the 3 deaths are not separate. They are one chain, and the chain has been forged by one person who is in this room with us tonight." The fire crackled. No one spoke. Let me tell you the story as I have come, slowly, to understand it. 4 years ago, Sir Henry Ashgrove discovered that someone close to him had been engaged in a long and systematic, let us call it deception. The deception had been continuing for some time, and had cost him a substantial sum, but the sum was not the chief concern. The chief concern was the violation of trust. Sir Henry was a man who valued trust above almost any other quality. The discovery wounded him deeply. He resolved to act. But he was a kind man also, and a methodical one, and he wished to give the deceiver one final opportunity to confess, to make restitution, to retire from his life before any official step was taken. He arranged a confrontation. He set out his evidence in writing in case anything should happen to him. He fixed the date for his interview, the 18th of November. The deceiver, let us call him by his name, Stephen Lockwood, knew that the interview was coming. He was not Stephen alone. Stephen had taken money. Stephen was guilty of theft. But Stephen was also a man who had loved the family for 15 years, who had loved Lady Margaret in particular, in his quiet way, with a constancy which he never permitted himself to declare. Stephen, faced with disgrace, would not, I believe, have killed Sir Henry. He would have confessed, repaid what he could, accepted dismissal, and left. He was, as Mademoiselle Veronica overheard him say to Sir Henry on the night before the death, defiant. "You will do nothing of the kind, Henry, because you have not the proof." But his defiance was the defiance of a man hoping to bluff, not the defiance of a man preparing to murder. But Stephen was not alone in his danger. Stephen had a confidant. Stephen had told someone of his troubles and of Sir Henry's intentions, and that someone, my friends, had reasons of their own for wishing Sir Henry not to live till the 18th of November. Sir Henry's death, on the 17th, was not from his weakened heart. It was from a small dose of cyanide in a glass of brandy brought to him in the library, late, by a hand he trusted. The glass was washed. The bottle of digitalis on Sir Henry's desk was rearranged to suggest a confused dosage. The lamp was left burning. The figure slumped naturally over the blotter. Dr. Hare, summoned the next morning, observed the empty glass and was uneasy, but in his loyalty to a long friendship signed the certificate of natural death. The library was locked. The matter was closed. Or so it appeared. But 3 things remained, which the murderer did not know. First, Sir Henry's written statement, sealed and untouched in the cabinet, which Lady Margaret moved after the death to her own safe, without opening, and which I read this morning. Second, Mademoiselle Veronica's overheard quarrel and the torn fragment of paper she preserved. And third, Stephen Lockwood himself. Stephen, who knew, or guessed, or feared, that his own confidant had killed for him, and who lived for 4 years afterwards in silence with the knowledge. Now we come to the present. 2 months ago, in August, Mademoiselle Veronica met at a country house. A young man named Anthony Fane. Mr. Fane was charming, intelligent, ambitious, and in serious financial difficulties. He attached himself to Mademoiselle Veronica. He learned swiftly that she was an heiress, that her fortune was contingent on the conditions of a will, and that the conditions could be, if certain old matters were stirred, perhaps loosened. He came to Ashgrove village a day early, on the Friday before this weekend. He stayed at the inn. He met on at least 2 occasions a man whom he had, by means I have not entirely traced but suspect to have been a London inquiry agent's report, identified as a person of interest in this household. That man was Stephen Lockwood. Mr. Fane confronted Mr. Lockwood on Thursday evening with knowledge of the embezzlement. But Mr. Fane was a young man of large appetite. Mere embezzlement was not enough for him. From Lockwood, through pressure, through threat, through shrewdness, he extracted the further suggestion, the further suspicion, that Sir Henry had been murdered. He did not learn from Lockwood the murderer's identity. Lockwood, I believe, never told him. But Mr. Fane was clever, and he had the run of the house from Saturday morning. He rummaged. He found, yes, the torn fragment of paper which Mademoiselle Veronica had kept for 4 years in a drawer she had not locked in her own writing desk, where he had been left alone for half an hour on Saturday afternoon. He understood that the rest of that paper, the larger part, the part that contained perhaps further accusations, was somewhere in the house. He set himself to finding it. On Friday afternoon, before he came to the house, Mr. Fane wrote to a firm of London solicitors, naming the person whom he had now satisfied himself was the murderer of Sir Henry. He named that person on the basis of his own observation, his own understanding of the family relations and certain hints which Lockwood had given without intending to. The solicitors received the letter on Saturday morning. They wrote in reply on Saturday evening, asking for further evidence. By the time their reply was posted, Anthony Fane was already in Ashgrove Castle, beginning the most ambitious and most foolish week of his short life. On Sunday, yesterday, Mr. Fane was active. He sounded out the colonel in the gun-room to test the temperature of the household's resistance to his marriage. The colonel rebuffed him. Mr. Fane rebuffed back with hints of information. Mr. Fane spent the afternoon, I'm sure, in further searches of the house. By dinner he had, I believe, located in his own mind the place where the principal evidence was concealed, the cabinet in the locked library. He had also in his pocket a piece of paper, perhaps a copy of a letter, perhaps a note he had drafted to his solicitors, which he carried with him through the meal, his hand returning to his breast pocket, as Mademoiselle Veronica observed. He had perhaps also arranged a meeting in the Orchard summer house with the very person whom he intended to denounce. At 11:30 he went out by the garden door. He went to the summer house. He met someone there. The meeting, I believe, was not an attempt at extortion of cash. It was rather a final test. Mr. Fane, in his arrogance, wishing to confront his adversary face to face, to make sure of his ground before laying his proofs before the family. The meeting concluded with Mr. Fane returning towards the house. The other party also returned by the lower path, having shed, somewhere along the way, a small horn button from the front of an overcoat. Mr. Fane reached the library. The door was unlocked. Why? Because Mr. Lockwood, earlier in the evening, on instructions, on persuasion, on cooperation that he afterwards bitterly regretted, had unlocked it and laid out the green-shaded reading lamp and set the stage. Mr. Lockwood believed, I think, that there would be a conversation in the library, that Mr. Fane would be confronted and reasoned with and perhaps bought off. Mr. Lockwood did not know that there was, in a small glass on the writing table, a portion of cyanide. He did not know, Hastings, and that is what he meant when he wrote in his letter that I would conclude he was the murderer of Anthony Fane, and would be partly correct. He was partly the murderer. He had set the scene. He had not laid the poison. Mr. Fane entered the library. He found his adversary already there. They spoke. Mr. Fane drew out the paper from his breast pocket and laid it on the table as evidence of what he intended. He was offered a glass of brandy, perhaps to seal a bargain, perhaps to celebrate a settlement. He drank. Within a minute he was failing. As he fell, his hand closed convulsively upon the paper. The murderer, in haste, tore it from his hand, but tore only the bulk of it, leaving a fragment caught between the dead fingers. Then, fearing perhaps that the cyanide had not been swift or certain enough, the murderer struck him a blow on the temple with, I do not yet know with what, to be sure. The murderer left the lamp burning. The murderer left the library. The murderer climbed the back stairs. The murderer reached his room, or her room, before the cry, which was, I now believe, the cry of Mr. Fane himself in the moment of seizure, could draw any reply. Mademoiselle Cecily, at her window, saw a figure cross the lawn from the direction of the orchard towards the house. The figure was a man, or more accurately a person in a long coat and soft hat, walking unsteadily. Walking unsteadily, my friends, because the figure had just done what no one in this house has ever done before, and has been carrying, I have no doubt, ever since, the burden of 2 murders. This morning the household began to crack. Sir Henry's sealed statement was found. Mr. Fane's solicitors were about to be contacted. Stephen Lockwood, examining his own situation, understood that he was about to be exposed not only as an embezzler, but as the accomplice, the unwitting accomplice, of 2 murders. He understood also that the true murderer, faced with exposure, would not stop at 2. Stephen Lockwood made his choice. He wrote a letter taking the murder of Anthony Fane upon himself. He took also the embezzlement upon himself, which was true. He left the letter in his office. He went out by the window. He went to meet, for the last time, the murderer by the weir at the lake. He hoped, I believe, to persuade the murderer to leave the house to spare the rest. He was struck from behind and fell into the water and is dead. Poirot paused. The fire roared in the grate. No one in the room had moved. Lady Margaret's eyes were closed. Tears stood, unwiped, upon her cheeks. The Colonel's face was the colour of stone. Veronica was holding her father's hand. Cecily sat upright, her pale eyes fixed upon the fire, her face very still. Dr. Hare's hand had come up to cover his mouth. The murderer, my friends, is in this room. The murderer killed Sir Henry on the 17th of November 4 years ago, with cyanide in a glass of brandy. The murderer killed Anthony Fane last night in the library, with cyanide in a glass of brandy. The murderer killed Stephen Lockwood this afternoon with a blow to the head and the cold water of the weir. The murderer is the person in this room whose interest in Sir Henry's death 4 years ago I have not, until this evening, properly understood, and who has been patient and silent and very, very careful for 4 years, and who tonight at last has come to the end of his patience and the limit of his careful arrangements. He turned, slowly, and his eyes rested not upon any of the family but upon the elderly ruddy figure of Dr. Julian Hare. It is you, Doctor, n'est-ce pas? Chapter 15. The Doctor's Account. For a long moment Dr. Hare did not move. His hand remained at his mouth. His ruddy face in the firelight had become the dull yellow of old wax. Then, very slowly, he lowered his hand and laid it upon his knee, and looked up at Poirot, and, strangest of all, smiled. It was a small, weary, almost tender smile, the smile of a man who has at last laid down a burden he has carried for a very long time. "Yes, Monsieur Poirot," he said. "It is I." Lady Margaret's intake of breath was the sound of a person struck. "Julian, Julian!" "Margaret, my dear, I am sorry. I am more sorry than I can say. I do not understand. Julian, Henry was your friend. Henry was my friend, Margaret. He was my dearest friend. I want you to understand this. I did not begin by wishing to harm him. Will you all let me tell it? I should like, before whatever comes next, and tell it once." Inspector Mowbray very quietly took up his pencil. "Doctor," said Poirot, "we shall hear you. Speak." The doctor folded his hands and looked at the fire and began. His voice was steady, almost conversational, as though he were describing a case at a medical society dinner. I have been physician to this family for 40 years. I delivered Veronica into the world. I attended Henry through every illness of his life. I attended his father before him. I have, over those 40 years, accepted from this house perhaps £30,000 in fees and gifts and small generosities. I have also lost, through bad investments, through poor management, through a kind of inattention to my own affairs which I had thought of as being above mere money, perhaps £50,000. By the spring of the year Henry died, I was very nearly bankrupt, and I had concealed this fact from him, and from everyone for nearly 2 years. Stephen Lockwood, in the course of his embezzlement, came to a moment of crisis around that same time. He had not the resources to make good. He came to me, for I had foolishly lent him my ear in some earlier difficulty, and he confided in me. He told me that Henry had begun to suspect, that the entries had been examined, that there would be, within weeks, an accounting. He came to me, monsieur, for advice, and I gave him advice. He paused. I told him that he must repay, that he must throw himself upon Henry's mercy, that Henry was a kind man and would not destroy him. I believed it when I said it, and then I went home, and I sat at my own desk, and I considered my own affairs, and I considered that if there were an inquiry into Lockwood's accounts, there would inevitably be, in time, an inquiry into other accounts also, and that certain advances, certain small loans, that I had made to myself against fees not yet due, against expectations of inheritance from old patients, would not perhaps bear scrutiny. I knew that Henry, once he began to look, would look at all the doors. And so I considered, monsieur, what I have considered 50 times since with horror, and once, on that night, with what I believed to be cold reason. I considered that Henry was a sick man. I considered that his death, were it to occur in the next fortnight, would close every door. I considered that I had at my disposal certain materials in my dispensary, of which a small quantity, properly administered, would produce a death indistinguishable, to a less thorough physician than myself, from the death he'd been expected for some years to die. I came down to Ashgrove on the Friday before the 17th. I knew Henry's habits. I knew that he sat in the library until late, and that he rang for whisky and soda at about 10. I told Pearson, on the night of the 17th, that I would take the tray to Henry myself. Henry and I had matters of medicine to discuss, I said, and I would save Pearson the journey. Pearson was grateful. I prepared the tray myself, with the addition of cyanide in the glass which I knew Henry would use. I brought the tray to the library. I sat with Henry. We spoke of trivial things. I watched him drink. I watched him die. I rinsed the glass at the small table in the corner, where there is a decanter and a basin. I left the empty glass on his table. I made some adjustments to the medicines on his desk. I left, by the side door, locking the library behind me with the key from his pocket, which I afterwards returned. I went up to my room and I went to bed, and I slept. I'm not proud, monsieur, of having slept, but I slept. Through the night. In the morning I was summoned. I made my examination. I found the glass. The smell by then was very faint. I told myself that an overworked country doctor, called early to the bedside of an old friend, could be forgiven for not analysing every glass. I signed the certificate. The library was locked. The matter was closed. Stephen, of course, knew. Stephen knew at once. Stephen had told me himself the day before of Henry's plan, and Stephen was no fool. He came to me the day after the funeral and we spoke. He said only, I shall remember his words always, "Doctor, what you have done, you have done. It cannot be undone. I shall keep your secret, because to expose you now would not bring Henry back, and would only destroy this family further. But I shall not be your friend, doctor. We shall be courteous. We shall not be friends. And we have, monsieur, for 4 years been courteous. We have not been friends. Stephen, I should add." Stephen continued his embezzlement, on a smaller scale, for some time after Henry's death, partly from habit, partly from need, partly, I think, from a sort of grim irony at the situation in which he found himself. I have wondered, often, whether Margaret would ever discover it. I knew that, if she did, the trail would lead in the end to me, but she did not. Stephen managed his accounts cleverly. Time passed. Then came Anthony Fane. I disliked him from the first day. I disliked his eyes, which were too clever, and his hands, which were too soft. When he arrived on Saturday, I observed at once that he was watching the household, watching us all, with the watchfulness of a man making notes for a use to come. By Saturday evening, I was uneasy. By Sunday morning, when I overheard a fragment of conversation between Mr. Fane and Stephen in the upper corridor, I was alarmed. By Sunday afternoon, when Stephen came to my room and told me what Mr. Fane was attempting, I knew that the moment I had feared for 4 years had come. Stephen and I, between us, devised a plan. Stephen's plan, monsieur, was different from mine. Stephen believed that Mr. Fane could be reasoned with, that we could meet him that night in the library, present him with such evidence of the family's disinclination to be moved, and offer him a small sum to depart and to be silent. I believed otherwise. I knew Mr. Fane's type. I knew that any payment would be the first of many. I knew that he had already, perhaps, set things in motion which could not be called back. I prepared, on my own account, a glass containing cyanide. I prepared it that afternoon in my room, with materials from my medical bag. I had brought them with me, monsieur, when I came to Ashgrove on Saturday. Not, I tell myself, with any settled intention, but merely as I had told myself, in case. In case. They are dangerous words, those. At 11, Stephen unlocked the library. He laid out the lamp. He went up to his office to wait for my signal. He believed I was below, preparing tea and brandy on a tray. I was. I prepared also the glass. At about 1:15, Mr. Fane returned from his meeting in the summer-house. Yes, I had met him there earlier, telling him that I was empowered to speak for the family, and that I would meet him in the library at 1. He came in, and he and I spoke for perhaps a quarter of an hour. He laid his paper on the table. I poured. I offered him the glass. He drank, and within a minute he was failing. I tore the paper from his hand. I had not intended to strike him. But the cyanide acted slowly, and he was not dying, and he saw me, monsieur, in his last moment of consciousness, and his eyes were terrible, and I could not bear them. I struck him with the small brass paperweight from the writing table, and afterwards I returned the paperweight to its place. I did not, I assure you, plan that blow. I left the library, I climbed the back stairs, I went to my room. I was unsteady, monsieur. Mademoiselle Cecily from her window saw me cross the lawn, but I had not crossed any lawn. She saw me, I think, walking from the side door to my own staircase by way of the terrace, in a fit of disorientation. I had drunk no brandy, I had eaten nothing, but I was as a man drugged. I went to my room, I lay upon my bed, I did not sleep. This morning Stephen came to me. He had understood, the moment he entered the library at 5 o'clock, what I had done. He did not condemn me, monsieur. He said only, "Doctor, you have killed twice. You will not, I trust, kill a third time." I assured him I would not. I begged him to keep silence. He said, "I shall keep silence as long as I can, but I shall not this time lie for you indefinitely. There is a limit, doctor, to what one can carry." He went out. All day I waited, and I watched. By the afternoon I understood, from the bearing of Monsieur Poirot, from the exchanges between the inspector and the household, that Stephen would not be able to keep silence. I went to him in his office, after lunch. I begged him. He showed me the letter he had begun to write, the letter taking the death of Anthony Fane upon himself. He said, "I will sign this. I will go away. They will believe it. You will be safe, on the condition that you go away also, that you leave the practice, that you leave Ashgrove, and that you never return." I agreed. I agreed. He left me in the office. He told me he would meet me at the weir at 5 o'clock and that we would walk together to the village where he had arranged transport. I went down, by a different way. I waited at the weir. He came. He had the letter in his pocket. He told me to go. He told me he had decided to leave the letter on his desk where it would be found. He told me that if I ever returned to England, he would, even from his exile, write to the police. And then, monsieur, and then I struck him. I've asked myself in the hours since why. I do not know. Perhaps it was because I knew in my heart that he would not keep silence forever. Perhaps it was because I knew that I could not. Perhaps also it was because in his face, in that moment I saw what he had carried for 4 years, the knowledge of what I was, and I could not bear to live, even in exile, with the thought of someone in the world who knew. I struck him with a stone from the bank. He fell into the water. I I came back to the house. I changed my coat. I burned the wet sleeves in my fire, and I went down to dinner, and I made conversation about Italian holidays, and I waited." He stopped. His hands had been folded throughout. He had not raised his voice. He had not wept. He looked now only very tired. "That, monsieur, is the account. I should be glad if you would find it in some particulars adequate." Poirot inclined his head very gravely. "Doctor, your account agrees, in every particular which can be tested, with the evidence I have gathered. The horn button from the breast of your old grey overcoat which you put aside this morning, the smear of mud from your own boots into which you had not changed at the orchard meeting, the brass paperweight which Inspector Mowbray's men recovered on my instruction from the lower drawer of the library writing table where you had returned it, the wire from Mr. Fane's solicitors, naming you, monsieur, as the person whom he had identified. Tout cela, Mr. Cords. He named me. He named you, doctor. He had observed in his short stay what some of us had failed to observe in years. He had observed that of all the persons in this house, you were the one whose life would have been most severely altered 4 years ago by an inquiry into Sir Henry's affairs. He had observed also the small, precise way in which you watched the family, even at meals, like a man checking a balance sheet. He named you in his letter because he had a young man's confidence that he could not be wrong. He was not wrong. He was not wrong." The doctor was silent. Then slowly he rose. "Inspector Mowbray, I am at your service." "Dr. Hare," said the inspector very quietly, "I must caution you that anything you have said, and anything further you may say, will be— I know the formula, Inspector. I have heard it, often enough, given to others. I shall come quietly. I should be glad, Margaret, my dear, I should be glad to be permitted before I leave this house, 1 moment alone with you, in which to ask, although I have no right to ask, your forgiveness." Lady Margaret rose. She stood, very tall, very white, her hands clenched at her sides. "Julian, I shall not forgive you tonight. I do not know whether I shall ever forgive you. But you may speak with me. 5 minutes." She walked from the room. The doctor, with a small bow to Poirot, followed her. The constable, on the inspector's nod, followed at a respectful distance. In the silence that followed, no one in the drawing-room moved or spoke for a long time. The fire had begun by slow degrees to die down. Veronica at last made a small sound, half a sigh, half a sob, and pressed her face against her father's sleeve. The colonel laid his hand, with a gentleness I had not seen in him before, upon her hair. Cecily, in her small chair on Poirot's left, had not moved through the entire account. Now, very slowly, she turned her head and looked at Poirot. "Monsieur," she said, you knew before tonight." "I knew, mademoiselle, when I read the wire from Mr. Fane's solicitors, not before, and you allowed me to sit here while he confessed." "I allowed you to sit here, mademoiselle, so that you should hear, with your own ears, the account of a death which has, I think, lain across your life for 4 years. I did not wish you to hear it second-hand. I wished you to hear it from him. Pardonnez-moi if I was wrong." She did not answer at once. Then very quietly, "You were not wrong, monsieur. Thank you." And she rose, and went to where Veronica sat, and knelt beside her cousin, and laid her arms about her, and the 2 girls, for they were, in that moment, only girls who had grown up together in a house full of secrets, wept together, in front of the fire, in a room which had at last begun to be honest. Chapter 16. The Last Train from Ashgrove. We left Ashgrove Castle the next afternoon, by the 4 o'clock train. The morning had been occupied with the formal business of Inspector Mowbray's investigation, depositions taken, statements signed, the body of Stephen Lockwood removed under tarpaulin to the village mortuary. Dr. Hare had been driven to Ipswich at first light, very calmly, in the rear of the police motor car, and had not, the inspector told us, spoken on the journey except to remark, once, upon a particular tree and flower along the road, he would be tried at the Suffolk Assizes in February. The doctor's solicitors, he had requested, should be Charteris and Pole, the same firm which Anthony Fane had retained 4 days before his death. There was, my friend Poirot observed, in this last courtesy, a certain bleak symmetry which Dr. Hare himself would no doubt have appreciated. Lady Margaret received us in the morning room before luncheon. She had aged in 24 hours by some years. but she was in her bearing more upright than I had seen her since our arrival. The fear that had hung about her had gone. What had taken its place was grief, a clean, hard grief, the grief of a woman who had at last understood the shape of her losses and who had decided to bear them. Monsieur Poirot, she gave him her hand, I do not know how to thank you. Madame, you do not need to thank me. I came because you asked. I should have come for less. The letter that Stephen left for me. Captain Hastings tells me that you found it in his safe and did not open it. It was not for me to open, she nodded. Her hand, holding the small unopened envelope, trembled very slightly. I shall read it tonight, alone. That, madame, is right. Monsieur, Stephen was a thief, and a kind of accomplice in 2 murders. He was not, you have told me, a murderer himself. But his hand was in this house, in shadow, for 4 years. His hand was in this house, madame. So was his heart. It is a thing for which there is, I'm afraid, no easy accounting. She looked at him steadily. I know what you're telling me, monsieur. I had not entirely failed to see it in 15 years, but I had thought it best, for both our sakes, just to pretend that I had not seen it. Madame, that is what we do sometimes for those we respect. Yes, her voice was low. Yes, thank you, monsieur. There was a silence. Then she said, more briskly, Veronica is this morning much altered. Last night, after you'd gone to bed, she sat with Cecily for 2 hours by the drawing-room fire, and the 2 of them spoke as they have not spoken since they were children. I do not know what they said. I know only that this morning Veronica came to me and laid her head upon my shoulder and said, Aunt Margaret, I have been a fool, and I am sorry. It is the first time she has called me Aunt Margaret in 7 years. I had not known, monsieur, how much I'd missed it. Mademoiselle Veronica is, I think, a young woman of considerable courage. She's only required to discover that the courage was for something other than running away. Yes, and Cecily has asked me this morning whether she might begin to learn the management of the estate. She says that Stephen in some way used to speak with her about it, on his evenings off in the garden, and that she had always been interested but had not thought she had the right. I told her she had every right. We shall do it together. That is excellent, madame. Mademoiselle Cecily has, I think, been quiet for too long. Quietness is a virtue, but like all virtues it can be carried too far. Yes. A small smile, the first I'd seen from her. We had all carried too many things too far in this house. Perhaps we shall stop now. She walked us to the door. The car had been brought round. Monsieur Poirot, Captain, I shall not see you again, but Ashgrove will not forget you. Madame, I shall remember Ashgrove. She gave him her hand once more and then, with a small formal bow, gave it to me. Captain Hastings. Lady Margaret. The car took us to the station by the long drive between the bare trees. The Colonel was at the gate, alone, and lifted his hand to us as we passed. Veronica and Cecily were on the front steps. Veronica raised her hand high. Cecily more shyly lifted hers only to her shoulder. Pearson stood by the door, very stiff, very correct, holding our valises until the very last moment, when he handed them in with the air of a man performing a sacred duty. The station platform was empty. The 4 o'clock to Liverpool Street drew in 5 minutes late. We boarded. The carriage was empty. Poirot arranged himself in the corner, removed his hat, settled it with care upon the rack, and at last permitted himself the small relaxation of a man who has, after long labour, been allowed to rest. The train whistled, jolted, and began to move. We sat in silence as the long water meadows of Ashgrove gave way to flat fields, then to the open the first small village, then to the open downs, the sky already darkening towards evening. After perhaps 10 minutes, I spoke. Poirot. Yes, Hastings. When did you first suspect Hare? He considered, looking out of the window at the passing fields. I first wondered about the doctor, mon ami, yesterday morning, when he gave me his account of Sir Henry's death. The account it was too thorough. He told me of the empty glass, of the smell, of his own uneasiness, of his decision to sign the certificate out of friendship. It was the confession of a man uneasy in his conscience. But he was, I observed, very careful to direct that uneasiness against himself in only one particular, the failure to investigate. He did not, even in his confessional mood, express any uneasiness as to who might have placed the glass there. He spoke as if the question of the glass's origin had simply not occurred to him in 4 years. That, Hastings, was unnatural. A doctor with such a glass would in his own mind ask, who brought it? When? How? He told me he had asked Pearson, but he did not tell me he had asked himself. The question had been suppressed, and only one type of person suppresses such a question, my friend. The person to whom the answer is known, and known unbearably. And the second confirmation? The second confirmation was the small smear of mud on the library carpet. The garden was wet that night. The footprints at the orchard gate showed a man with smooth-soled evening shoes, Mr. Fane, and a woman with a low heel. There were no muddy boots at the orchard summer house, except for the marks of Mr. Fane himself in his evening pumps, which had walked there and into the library. Yet there was mud on the library carpet which did not match Mr. Fane's tread. It was a small, dry crumb, which had fallen from the upper of a country boot, from the side, not the sole, as the wearer had stood in the library. Whoever wore the boot had walked through the kitchen garden, where the soil is reddish, not through the orchard, where the path is gravelled. Of all the men in the house, only one would have had no reason to be in the kitchen garden at any time on Sunday, and only one had quietly cleaned a borrowed pair of boots that morning, leaving a small smear by the heel. That was Mr. Lockwood's pair, but Lockwood had not worn them. The doctor had borrowed them, for his orchard meeting, not for the murder itself, to leave a footprint other than his own, in case any was found. He had taken them back, cleaned them, and replaced them. He was a methodical man, but he was not, for one small smear, methodical enough. And the wire from Charteris and Pole, when it came, named the doctor. By that hour I had already considered him. The wire was confirmation, not revelation, but I had to be certain, mon ami, before I spoke. A confession in the drawing-room is theatre, but it is theatre with consequences. I would not stage it on suspicion, I staged it on knowledge. And Lockwood's letter, you knew at once that it was false? I knew, Hastings, at once that it was incomplete. A confession that confesses to Anthony's death and not to Sir Henry's, when both deaths are linked, is a confession that protects someone. The someone, given Stephen's known affections, was either Lady Margaret or another. The doctor had been Stephen's confidant for many years. The arithmetic was not difficult. He paused. The train slowed for a small station, did not stop, gathered speed again. And yet, Hastings, the case was for me melancholy. Not because of Hare. Hare had made his choice, and his choice is between him and his God, of whom I shall not pretend to speak. Melancholy for the others. For Margaret, who lived for 15 years beside a man who loved her and did not say, and for 4 years beside a friend who had killed her husband and did not say. For Veronica, who silenced her own evidence for 4 years out of misplaced kindness. For Cecily, who learned at 19 that the safest thing was to be quiet, and who had to be ungently reminded at 23 that there are situations in which quietness is a complicity. For Lockwood, who chose in the end to die for a friend who was not by that hour his friend. For Anthony Fane, who was a vain young man, but who had loved Veronica enough to gamble his life on her, and who lost. C'est triste, Hastings. It is sad. The grey cells they solve, but what they reveal, sometimes one wishes a little less revelation. I considered this for some time, watching the lights of a passing village wink across the carriage window. Poirot, when we go to a country house next, may we please stay only for the shooting? He laughed, a short, dry laugh which from him was the equivalent of mirth. Mon cher Hastings, when we go to a country house next, we shall, I assure you, stay only for the shooting. And on the second day somebody will be shot, and on the third day you and I shall be once more at the centre of an affair, and I shall once more pretend to complain, and you shall once more pretend to be surprised. It is our destiny, mon ami. It is also, I confess, our pleasure. There is no use denying it. The train rushed on into the gathering dark towards London. The lamps of small farms passed one by one, like the lights of departing rooms in a great house being put to bed. I closed my eyes. The last image I carried, for a long time afterwards, was not of the doctor's confession, nor of Stephen Lockwood in the reeds, nor of Anthony Fane upon the blotter. It was of Cecily Pell in the orchard, looking up at a single late apple on a bare branch and saying with that strange flat clarity, I am not always brave. Sometimes I am only quiet. There is a difference. It was, I thought, the truest thing said in that house in 12 years, and it was perhaps the small, stubborn, almost invisible point upon which Hercule Poirot, with his moustaches and his methods and his foreign vanity, had at last hung the unravelling of a knot that had been 4 years in the tying. The library at Ashgrove Castle, I have heard since, has been opened and aired, and is once more in use. Lady Margaret and Cecily sit there, in the evenings, and read. The lamps are kept lit until late. There are no more locked rooms in that house. It is, in its small way, a kind of victory. Captain Arthur Hastings, from notes made on the journey home.